The impact was sudden, a jarring shock of bone against bone that sent a jolt of adrenaline screaming through Lieutenant Raina Thorne's nervous system. Marcus Brennan's hands had slammed into her shoulders with the practiced weight of an athlete, a shove delivered with enough force to upend a grown man. There was no warning, no preamble of a footstep on the gravel roof of Malvesty Hall. One moment she was observing the moonlit perimeter, and the next, the world simply tilted. Gravity, cruel and indifferent, seized her body, yanking her back toward the yawning darkness of the courtyard several stories below. She didn't scream. In the vacuum of those terrifying seconds, Raina didn't waste oxygen on a sound that wouldn't save her. She didn't flail her arms in a desperate, useless windmill. Instead, her training, etched into her muscles through decades of repetition, took over. As she fell, her eyes remained fixed on the receding ledge. Her right hand shot out like a whip, her fingers hooking into the edge of the weathered metal roof gutter. The sharp edge bit deep into her palms, the galvanized steel shrieking as it bore her full weight. Her body swung like a heavy pendulum, her boots thudding against the rough, cold brick of the wall. The jarring stop nearly dislocated her shoulder, a white-hot flare of pain erupting in her joint, but she held on. Above her, the silence was broken not by a gasp of horror, but by laughter. It was a sharp, barking sound, genuine amusement. Marcus Brennan stood at the edge, flanked by his usual shadows, peering down at her dangling form. To them, this wasn't an attempted murder or a catastrophic lapse in judgment. It was a joke. It was a prank played on someone they deemed beneath them. Brennan leaned over, his face illuminated by the pale moonlight, looking for all the world like he was watching a comedy show rather than a woman fighting for her life. To these men, pushing a civilian consultant off a building was just another Thursday night at Fort Benning, a little extracurricular fun to break the monotony of Ranger School. Before we continue with the fallout of this betrayal and find out if Raina can pull herself back from the brink, I want to take a quick second to say thank you for being here. If you're enjoying the tension of this story, please hit that subscribe button right now and stick with me until the very end. Your support keeps these stories coming. And while you're at it, drop a comment telling me what city or country you are watching from. I love seeing how far these tales of justice and grit travel across the globe. Trust me, you won't want to miss what happens when these arrogant cadets realize exactly who they just tried to kill. Because this wasn't just a random act of violence. This was the moment arrogance met ignorance. To understand how a veteran like Raina Thorne ended up hanging from a gutter while 20-somethings laughed at her, we have to go back 3 days. It started when Raina walked through the main gates of Fort Benning wearing nothing more threatening than a pair of worn jeans and a plain, dark jacket. She looked like anyone's aunt, an older sister, or a tired office worker. She certainly didn't look like a woman who could end your life in 12 different ways before your body hit the dirt. Raina had been out of active duty for 2 years, trying her hand at a quiet life, but her body hadn't forgotten a single lesson from her time in the teams. At 43, she moved with a quiet, cat-like efficiency. It was the kind of movement that only comes from spending years in places where a single misplaced footstep or a loud breath could get your entire squad killed. Her dark hair was pulled back in a practical, no-nonsense ponytail. She wore no makeup, no jewelry, and carried no weapons, at least none that were visible. The only accessory she permitted herself was a rugged, scratched watch that had survived 3 deployments to the most hostile corners of the earth. She carried a single messenger bag over her shoulder and a government-issued tablet tucked under her arm. To any soldier passing by, she was just another faceless civilian contractor, perhaps there to audit the food service or check the building's plumbing. She was invisible, and she liked it that way. Colonel James Whitaker met her at the administrative building. His face was a map of the last 30 years of American conflict, weathered and lined, but it broke into a genuine, warm smile when he saw her. They had served together back when Whitaker was still a captain getting his boots muddy in the field, long before the Army decided he was more valuable behind a heavy oak desk than behind a rifle. "Raina," he said, his voice a low rumble. He gripped her hand firmly, his eyes scanning her face. "You look exactly the same." "You're a terrible liar, Jim," she replied, though her voice held a rare note of affection. "But the gray suits you. It makes you look like you actually know what you're doing." Whitaker chuckled and led her through the corridors of the headquarters. The building smelled of institutional coffee, industrial floor polish, and the faint, lingering scent of old paper. They passed offices where clerks hummed through reports and younger officers debated training schedules with the kind of intensity only the military can produce. Whitaker didn't stop until they reached a small, windowless conference room. He stepped inside and closed the door, the click of the latch sounding strangely final. "I need to be straight with you about what you're walking into," he said, his voice dropping to a cautious level even though the room was secure. "The Ranger training program here has issues. Big ones. We've had 3 washouts in the last 6 months who filed formal complaints about the culture. They weren't complaining about the physical rigor. Everyone expects that. They were complaining about something much darker." Raina set her bag on the table and leaned back, her eyes narrowing. "What kind of pattern are we talking about? The kind where guys who think they're God's gift to warfare decide that the rules of the civilized world don't apply to them," Whitaker said, his jaw tightening. "The kind where instructors look the other way because they want to be the cool guys, or because they think boys will be boys. The kind where someone is going to get seriously hurt or killed if we don't figure out exactly what's broken and cut it out like a cancer. And you want me to be the eyes they don't see," Raina surmised. Whitaker nodded. "If they know you're a former SEAL, if they know your service record, they'll be on their best behavior. They'll give us the Sunday school version of the program. I need to see what happens when they think nobody important is watching. I need to see the real program, Raina, not the show they put on for the brass." Raina understood the mission immediately. She had seen it before in different units and different branches. Integrity was easy when the spotlight was on you and your career was on the line. But true character, the kind you needed in a foxhole at 3 in the morning, was what you did in the dark when you thought nobody was keeping score. "How long do I have?" she asked. 2 weeks, Whitaker replied. "You're officially listed as a consultant reviewing training efficiency and logistics. It's generic enough that nobody will care and boring enough that nobody will ask questions. You'll shadow the current class through their field exercises and observe their instruction. And if I see something that needs immediate intervention," Whitaker's expression grew pained. "Document it. Record it if you can. But Raina, I need the full picture. If you shut something down on day 1, we'll never know how deep this goes. We'll just be trimming the weeds instead of pulling them out by the roots." She didn't like the idea of letting misconduct slide, even for a moment, but she understood the cold logic. Sometimes you had to let the poison rise to the surface before you could drain it properly. On her first day, Raina was a ghost. She spent most of her time in the background, sitting on a weathered wooden bench near the main obstacle course. She had her tablet in her lap, her stylus moving across the screen as she appeared to be logging data on transit times and equipment wear. To the sweating, panting cadets, she was just paperwork in human form. But Raina wasn't looking at the equipment. She was counting. She was watching how many times an instructor corrected a cadet's form versus how many times they just screamed insults. She watched how many cadets reached back to pull a struggling teammate over a wall versus how many used their teammate as a stepping stone. She was looking for the leaders, the followers, and the predators. That was when Marcus Brennan first entered her crosshairs. He was a physical specimen, easily 6'2" with the kind of broad-shouldered build that came from elite genetics and thousands of hours in a high-end gym. His uniform was always perfectly crisp, even in the Georgia humidity, and he moved with a swagger that bordered on a strut. He attacked the obstacle course like it had personally insulted his family. He was fast, strong, and talented. There was no denying that. But every time he finished an exercise, which he did first more often than not, he made sure everyone within earshot knew about it. He would high-five his core group, a trio of cadets who orbited him like moons around a toxic planet. There was Vance, a stocky man with a neck like a fire hydrant and a voice that grated like sandpaper. There was Hoskins, lean and quick, who acted as Brennan's personal laugh track. And then there was Chen, the quietest of the bunch, who seemed to follow along out of a desperate need to belong to the winning team. Raina watched Brennan finish a grueling rope climb and drop to the dirt, barely winded. An instructor called out his time. It was decent, top tier even, but not record-breaking. Brennan didn't just accept the time. He shouted back that ropes got too much slack, Sergeant. Fix your gear and I'll break the record next time. The instructor, a grizzled sergeant with 2 decades of service and a face like a dried plum, just shook his head and checked the next name on his clipboard. But Raina saw the look in the sergeant's eyes. It was a look of profound weariness. He'd had this conversation with Brennan a dozen times, and he'd realized that correcting the boy's arrogance was more trouble than the army paid him for. On the second day, the heat had settled over the base like a wet wool blanket. Raina positioned herself near the classroom building where the tactical instruction was held. She arrived 10 minutes early, found a spot on a bench outside, and watched the cadets file in. Brennan arrived last, as usual, laughing about something with Vance. He was so busy performing for his friends that he nearly walked right over Raina. He stopped at the last second, looking down at her with a flick of his eyes that was purely dismissive. "Excuse me, ma'am," he said. The words were polite, but the tone was dripping with condescension, the way one might speak to a stray cat blocking a doorway. He didn't wait for her to move, he just sidestepped her, already talking to Vance about a party they were planning for the weekend. "No problem," Raina replied softly, not even looking up from her screen. She heard Vance mutter something as they walked away. She didn't catch the full sentence, but it ended with a sharp burst of laughter. She didn't need to hear the words to know the intent. She had heard that specific brand of laughter in 100 different contexts over her career. It was the sound of someone who had just judged another person and found them wanting. It was the laughter of the elite looking down at the common. The classroom session lasted 2 hours. Raina sat in the back corner, her tablet propped up as she ostensibly reviewed documentation. In reality, she was mapping the social dynamics of the room. The instructor was a captain named Rodriguez, a sharp, professional officer who walked them through urban combat scenarios. He spoke with the authority of someone who had actually cleared rooms under fire. But every time Rodriguez turned to the whiteboard, the atmosphere shifted. Brennan would lean over and whisper to Hoskins. A snicker would ripple through their row. It was death by 1,000 cuts, small disruptions, tiny acts of disrespect that were too minor to warrant a formal reprimand, but constant enough to undermine the captain's authority. Rodriguez would catch Brennan's eye, and Brennan would just offer a blank, innocent stare that said, "Asterisk, what are you going to do about it?" Asterisk, after class, Rodriguez caught Raina's eye for a fleeting second. He gave a tiny, almost imperceptible nod. It was the look of a man who was relieved to realize that someone else was finally seeing what he was seeing. That afternoon, the training moved into the dense pine forest surrounding the base for land navigation. Raina followed at a distance, her movements fluid and silent as she navigated the terrain. She had the coordinates for all the checkpoints, and she positioned herself in a thicket of brush to observe the teams as they moved through the course. She watched Brennan's team. They were undeniably efficient. Brennan led from the front, setting a punishing pace through the undergrowth, forcing his team to keep up or be left behind. But it was at the third checkpoint that the mask slipped. A younger cadet named Peters had reached the marker just ahead of Brennan's group. Peters was a smaller guy, looking utterly spent, his face a mask of sweat and dirt. He was checking his compass, doing the work, trying to maintain his bearings. Brennan walked right up to him. He didn't offer a word of encouragement. He didn't even acknowledge the kid's effort. "Peters," Brennan said, his voice loud in the quiet of the woods, "you're in the way." Peters looked up, blinking. "I'm just logging my arrival, Brennan. Give me a second." Brennan didn't give him a second. He laughed, a short, sharp sound that echoed off the trees, and then he reached out and swiped. He didn't hit Peters, but he knocked the map right out of the cadet's trembling hands. It flew through the air and landed face down in a deep, muddy puddle of stagnant rainwater. "Oops," Brennan said, his voice dripping with fake concern. "Butterfingers, you should really secure your gear, Peters. It's a dangerous world out here." Peters stared at the muddy mess of his only map. His face went bright red, his jaw working as he fought back a retort. While Peters was crouched in the mud trying to fish out his ruined navigation tool, Brennan's team logged their arrival with smug grins and vanished back into the trees. Raina recorded the incident on her tablet. Asterisk subject. Brennan M. Incident. Intentional interference and destruction of peer equipment. Note escalating patterns of harassment. Asterisk that evening the humidity hadn't broken. Raina was staying in a small, sparse room in the visiting officers' quarters. She spent hours typing up her observations, her fingers flying over the keys. Her phone buzzed on the nightstand, a text from Whitaker. Asterisk dinner, 1900. Officers' club, corner table. Asterisk she arrived precisely on time. Whitaker was already there, a cup of black coffee in front of him. He looked like he hadn't slept in a week. "Tell me," he said, skipping the small talk. Raina laid it out. She told him about the subtle disruptions in the classroom. She told him about the accidental shoulder checks. She described the incident in the woods with Peters and the map. She spoke with a cold, clinical detachment that made the details seem even more damning. "Brennan," she said, leaning forward, "tell me about his father." Whitaker sighed, rubbing the bridge of his nose. "General Marcus Brennan, Sr., 3 stars, currently the deputy commander of FIRSTCOM. He's a legend in certain circles. He's also a man who doesn't believe in failure. The kid's been trading on that name since the second he stepped off the bus. He thinks the 3 stars on his father's shoulders belong to him, too. Does the father know his son is a bully? The father thinks his son is the second coming of George Patton," Whitaker said grimly. "He calls me every other week to check in on Marcus Jr.'s progress. It's a veiled threat, Raina. He wants his son to have the Ranger tab so he can fast-track him to Special Forces. He doesn't care how he gets it." Raina sipped her coffee. It was bitter and lukewarm, but she didn't mind. "What do you want me to do, Jim?" "Keep watching," Whitaker said. "Document everything. I need a file so thick and so undeniable that even a 3-star general can't ignore it. I need him to have no room to maneuver when I finally move to wash the kid out." On the 3rd day, the pranks turned into something much more sinister. The cadets were assigned a 12-mile ruck march through the undulating, sandy hills of the training grounds, followed immediately by tactical maneuvers. It was designed to test their endurance and their ability to think clearly while physically shattered. Raina positioned herself at the halfway clearing, an old logging road where equipment caches were stored. She was dressed as a logistics contractor again, clipboard in hand, looking bored. Brennan's team roared through the clearing, looking fresh and arrogant. But 10 minutes later, Peters emerged from the tree line. He looked terrible. He was leaning heavily to one side, his face pale and his breathing ragged. As he got closer, Raina saw the problem. His rucksack was soaked. A dark, spreading stain covered the bottom of the heavy nylon pack, and water was dripping steadily onto his boots. Someone had slashed his hydration bladder. Not only was he losing his water in the brutal heat, but the water had soaked into his spare clothes and gear, adding 10 or 15 pounds of dead weight to an already heavy load. Peters collapsed in the clearing, gasping for air as he tried to unbuckle his pack. That was when Brennan, Vance, and Hoskins stepped out from behind a stack of supply crates. They hadn't moved on, they had circled back just to watch the fallout of their handiwork. "Having a little trouble there, Peters?" Brennan asked, leaning against a crate with a smirk. "Maybe the load is just too much for you. There's no shame in quitting, you know. Some people just aren't built for this." Peters looked up, his eyes bloodshot. "Someone cut my bladder, Brennan. I checked it this morning. It was fine." Brennan took a step forward, his smile disappearing into a mask of cold intimidation. "Are you calling me a liar, Peters? Because it sounds like you're making excuses for being weak. You're a whiner, you're not Ranger material." Raina watched from 20 feet away, her hand tightening on her clipboard. She was ready to move, ready to drop the persona and put Brennan on the ground if he laid a finger on the kid. But Brennan was smart. He knew where the line was. He just stood there, towering over the exhausted cadet, letting his presence do the talking. "Prove it," Brennan whispered. "Oh, wait, you can't, because you're nothing." The trio laughed and moved out, leaving Peters alone in the dirt. Raina waited until they were out of sight before she walked over to him. "You okay?" she asked, her voice low. Peters looked at her, and for a second she saw the raw, naked rage in his eyes, quickly replaced by a crushing sense of defeat. "I'm fine, ma'am, just an equipment failure. You should report it," she said. "Report it to who?" Peters asked, a bitter laugh escaping his lips. "His dad is a general. My dad is a plumber from Oklahoma. Who do you think they're going to believe?" He stood up, slung the heavy, wet pack over his shoulders, and began to limp forward. Raina watched him go, adding another entry to her mental file. This wasn't just a toxic culture anymore. This was a systematic breaking of a human being. That night's sleep was impossible. The heat of the day lingered in the walls of the barracks. Raina kept seeing the look on Peter's face. The look of a man who realized the system designed to protect him was actually the one holding the knife. At 2 in the morning, she gave up on the idea of rest. She pulled on a pair of dark tactical pants and a black hoodie, moving out into the stillness of the base. She found herself drawn toward Malvesti Hall. It was an old, 3-story brick building used for night studies and administrative storage. As she approached, she saw light flickering in a 2nd-story window. She moved into the shadows of a large oak tree, her senses heightened. There were voices, male voices, low and conspiratorial. Raina navigated the shadows with the ease of a ghost, finding a stack of wooden pallets that allowed her to peer through a side window. Inside, Brennan and his crew were gathered around a table. There were others there, too, cadets who weren't part of the inner circle but clearly wanted to be. In the center of the table was a stack of cash and a deck of cards. An illegal poker game was a violation of the rules, but it was small potatoes compared to what they were discussing. Peters is done, Vance said, tossing a coin onto the table. I give him 2 more days. You really slashed his bladder. Another cadet asked, his voice a mix of awe and fear. Vance grinned. I did the cutting. Marcus provided the distraction during the gear check. It was beautiful. Brennan leaned back in his chair, shuffling the cards with professional ease. We're doing the Army a favor. Better he washes out here than gets someone killed downrange because he's too soft. We only want the best in this company. What about that lady? Hoskins asked. The consultant. She's always around, like a bad smell. Brennan snorted, dealing the cards. Her? She's a nobody. Some contractor's wife who got a job because she knows someone in D. See, she wouldn't know a tactical error if it bit her on the nose. She isn't even military. It doesn't matter what she sees because she doesn't understand what she's looking at. Still, Vance said, leaning forward. She's always writing things down. It's creepy. Maybe we should discourage her, Brennan said. His eyes went cold, the playful arrogance replaced by something predatory. Make her understand that she's not welcome in our house. You want to mess with a civilian? Chen asked, sounding genuinely nervous for the first time. That seems like a bad move, Marcus. I want to mess with anyone who thinks they can judge us, Brennan snapped. We're Rangers. This is our world. It's time people remembered that. Raina had heard enough. She slipped away from the window, her heart pounding with a cold, focused anger. These weren't soldiers. They were a gang in uniform. She reached into her pocket and texted Whitaker. Asterisk meeting tomorrow. 0700. It's worse than we thought. Asterisk the next morning, Whitaker's office felt like a pressure cooker. He listened to her report of the poker game and the direct threats. He didn't interrupt, but his hands were clenched so tightly on his desk that his knuckles had turned a ghostly white. Did you record the conversation? He asked. No, Raina said. I was too far away, and the light from a phone would have blown my cover. It's my word against theirs. Whitaker stood up and paced to the window, looking out over the parade grounds. It's not enough, Raina. If I move against the son of a 3-star general based on the word of a civilian contractor, I'll be retired by the end of the week and the investigation will be buried. General Brennan called me again this morning. He's already talking about Marcus's post-graduation ceremony. Then let me get you something they can't ignore, Raina said, her voice like flint. How? Let me push back. Let me stop being the invisible lady with the tablet. If I become a problem, they'll try to handle me. And when they do, they'll make a mistake. Whitaker turned to look at her, his eyes searching hers. Raina, these are kids playing at being tough. You're the real thing. I don't want you getting hurt because you're trying to bait a trap. I've handled worse than Marcus Brennan, she said simply. That afternoon, the opportunity presented itself. The cadets were in the middle of a hand-to-hand combat session on the mats. Raina wasn't sitting on the bench this time. She was standing right at the edge of the mat, her arms crossed, watching them with a look of open, undisguised boredom. Brennan noticed the change immediately. After he finished tossing a smaller cadet to the ground, he walked over to her. He was dripping with sweat, his chest heaving, his presence designed to be intimidating. Ma'am, he said, his voice dripping with that same fake politeness. Can I ask what you're doing? You're in the way of the training. I'm observing, Raina said, not moving an inch, and from what I've seen, the training is pretty substandard. Brennan's eyes flashed. Substandard? I'm the top of this class. Maybe on paper, Raina said, letting a small, mocking smile play on her lips. But your form is sloppy. You rely on your weight instead of your technique. In a real fight against someone who knows what they're doing, you'd be on your back in 5 seconds. The entire gym went silent. Instructors and cadets alike stopped what they were doing to watch the civilian woman talk down to the general's son. You think you know something about fighting? Brennan asked, taking a step closer, invading her personal space. You've probably never even had a bruised knuckle. Maybe you should stay in your lane before you get hurt. Fort Benning can be a dangerous place, Raina said, echoing the words he'd used the night before. Lots of accidents happen. I'd hate to see you fail out because you couldn't control your ego. Brennan reached out then. It wasn't a strike, but a heavy, condescending pat on her shoulder, the same move he'd used before to show dominance. He leaned in, his voice a low hiss. Watch yourself, lady. You're not as safe as you think you are. He walked away, but the gauntlet had been thrown. Raina documented the exchange, but she knew the real test was coming. On the 5th day, the tension finally snapped during a live-fire exercise at the range. Reyna was in the observation tower, looking down through binoculars as the teams prepared their weapons. Peters was on the line, his hands steady despite the days of harassment he'd endured. But when the command to fire was given, Peters' rifle jammed on the very first round. He cleared it, attempted to fire again, and it jammed a second time. By the third time his weapon failed, the range officer screamed for a ceasefire. Reyna watched from the tower as they inspected Peters' weapon. They didn't find a mechanical failure. They found the ammunition. Someone had loaded his magazines with a random mix of live rounds and blanks. In a training exercise, it was a mess. In a real combat situation, it was a death sentence. The range officer was livid, but Brennan and his crew were already standing 20 yards away, looking as innocent as choir boys. Brennan even had the audacity to shrug at Reyna when he saw her looking down from the tower. Reyna met Whitaker in his office an hour later. She didn't even sit down. "They're crossing the line from bullying to sabotage that could kill someone," she said. "Mixed ammo is the end of the road, Jim." "I know," Whitaker said, looking defeated. "But the range officer can't prove who loaded those mags. It's a dead end." "Then let's stop playing their game," Reyna said. That evening, Reyna went to the gym. It was the scheduled PT time for the cadets, and the place was packed. She wasn't wearing her consultant's jacket. She was in a simple black tank top and athletic leggings. She looked lean, fit, and entirely unimpressed by the displays of hyper-masculinity around her. She headed straight for the pull-up bars. Brennan was at the bench press nearby, surrounded by his usual audience. She jumped up, grabbed the bar, and began a set of pull-ups. She didn't just do pull-ups. She did them with a slow, agonizingly perfect form. 10, 20, 30. She moved into muscle-ups, her body rising above the bar with a grace and power that made the clanking of weights around the room stop. One by one, the cadets stopped their workouts. They watched the civilian lady perform feats of strength that most of them struggled with. Brennan sat up from the bench, his face darkening as he realized the audience was no longer his. Reyna dropped from the bar, not even breathing hard. She looked directly at Brennan. "Is that the best you guys can do?" she asked, her voice carrying across the quiet gym. "Because I've seen middle schoolers with more heart." Brennan stood up, his face a mask of fury. "You think you're something? Let's see how you handle a real challenge." That was the hook. She had baited him, and he had bitten down hard. She knew that tonight they would come for her. They couldn't help themselves. Their egos wouldn't allow a nobody to show them up. Which brings us back to the roof of Malvesty Hall. Reyna's fingers were screaming as the metal of the gutter dug into her flesh. Above her, Brennan's laughter was subsiding, replaced by a cold, smug satisfaction. "You should have stayed in your lane, lady," Brennan said, leaning over the edge. "Now you're just another training accident." He turned to walk away, signaled to Vance and Hoskins to follow him. They thought it was over. They thought they had won. Reyna took a deep breath, ignoring the fire in her shoulder. She didn't just hang there. She used the momentum of her swing to kick her feet against the brick wall, pushing off and then slamming back. On the third swing, she reached up with her left hand, grabbing a solid stone decorative ledge just above the gutter. With a grunt of pure, focused effort, she hauled herself upward. Her muscles, forged in the fires of the most elite training on the planet, didn't fail her. She swung a leg over the parapet and rolled onto the roof, coming up in a crouch before the sound of Brennan's boots had even faded. "Brennan," she called out. The three men spun around, their faces going from triumph to pure, unadulterated shock in the span of a heartbeat. They stared at her as if she were a ghost risen from the grave. How did you?" Vance stammered, his eyes wide. Reyna didn't answer with words. She moved. She was across the roof before they could even raise their hands. She didn't strike Brennan first. She went for Vance, the one who had slashed the water bladder. She caught him with a palm strike to the chest that sent him reeling back, his breath leaving him in a wheezing rush. Hoskins tried to lung at her, but she sidestepped him with a fluid grace, catching his arm and using his own momentum to send him face first into the gravel of the roof. Then there was Brennan. He backed away, his hands up, the bravado finally beginning to crack. "Stay back. You're a civilian. You can't touch me." "I'm not a civilian, Marcus," Reyna said, her voice a low, terrifying growl. "I'm the nightmare you've been pretending to be." She stepped into his guard, her movements too fast for his untrained eyes to follow. She didn't use her full strength. She didn't want to kill him, not yet. She hit him with a series of precise, punishing strikes to the body, folding him like a piece of paper. When he fell to his knees, gasping for air, she grabbed him by the collar of his uniform and dragged him back to the edge of the roof. She held him there, his heels dangling over the same drop he had pushed her into just minutes before. "Is it funny now?" she whispered in his ear. "Is it a joke yet? Please." Brennan sobbed, the general's son reduced to a terrified boy. "Please don't." Reyna looked down at him, her eyes as cold as the stars. "You're right about one thing, Marcus. Fort Benning is a dangerous place, especially for people who lack character." She didn't drop him. Instead, she hauled him back and threw him into the center of the roof just as the door to the stairwell burst open. Colonel Whitaker stepped out, followed by a team of military police. He didn't need to ask what had happened. The sight of Brennan cowering on the ground and Reyna standing over him like an avenging angel told the whole story. The aftermath was swift and brutal. With the evidence Reyna had documented, the poker game, the sabotage of Peter's gear, and finally the attempted assault on the roof, not even a three-star general could save his son. Marcus Brennan, Jr., was not only washed out of the program but faced dishonorable discharge and criminal charges. Vance and Hoskins followed him into disgrace. As for Reyna, she stood at the gate of Fort Benning 2 days later, her messenger bag over her shoulder. Peters was there to meet her, looking like a different man. He stood taller, the weight of the bullying finally lifted from his shoulders. "Thank you, ma'am," he said, offering a crisp, respectful salute. Reyna didn't salute back. She was a civilian now, after all. She just offered a small, knowing smile. "Keep your gear tight, Peters, and remember, the uniform doesn't make the man makes the uniform." She walked out through the gates, disappearing into the civilian world as quietly as she had arrived. She was once again just an aunt or a sister in jeans and a jacket. But behind her, the Ranger program was a little cleaner, a little stronger, and a lot more aware that sometimes the most dangerous person in the room is the one you never bother to notice. The humid, heavy air of the Georgia evening seemed to cling to everything, turning the base gym into a greenhouse of sweat and recycled oxygen. It was that specific time of night when the high-intensity energy of the afternoon had faded, replaced by a grittier, more determined silence. Reyna hung from the pull-up bar, her muscles screaming in a rhythmic, familiar pulse. She liked the burn. It was a constant she could rely on when everything else in her life felt like a series of moving targets. She was on her 20th rep, her chin clearing the bar with a steady, controlled motion, when the silence was punctured. Vance's voice didn't just enter the room, it occupied it, dripping with a forced casualness that signaled trouble. He was leaning against a rack of dumbbells, his posture relaxed but his eyes sharp, tracking her every movement. He looked at her not as a fellow athlete, but as an intruder who had wandered into a private sanctum. He asked if she knew there was a civilian gym off base, his tone suggesting that her presence here was a breach of some unwritten code. To him, this was their space, a sanctuary for those in uniform, a place where they didn't have to worry about being watched or documented. Reyna didn't immediately respond. She finished her set, her movements fluid and deliberate, before dropping to the rubberized floor with a soft thud. She took a slow, measured drink from her water bottle, letting the silence stretch just long enough to show she wasn't intimidated. She cited the gym hours, 0600 to 2200, open to all authorized personnel and civilians. She pointed out that it was only 19:30 and she was well within her rights to be there. Her voice was flat, devoid of the defensive edge they were likely hoping for. Hoskins joined in then, his voice a low rumble that added to the weight of the room. He questioned why a civilian woman would want to spend her free time working out with a group of army guys. The implication was thick, that she was looking for something or someone, or perhaps that she was simply out of place in a world of testosterone and iron. Reyna's reply was simple. She worked out for the same reason everyone else did, to stay healthy. It was a shield of a response, one that gave them nothing to grip onto. Then Brennan stood up. Marcus Brennan didn't just move, he commanded the space around him. He had been pushing heavy iron, his muscles engorged with blood, his shirt a map of sweat stains that clung to his broad frame. He walked over, stopping exactly 3 feet away. It was a tactical distance, close enough to crowd her personal space and exert a physical pressure, but far enough that he could claim he was just standing there if an officer walked in. He told her she was always around, always in their business. He said it was starting to feel like an obsession. Reyna met his gaze. She didn't look at his chest or his arms. She looked directly into his eyes, searching for the man behind the bravado. She saw calculation there. Brennan wasn't just a bully, he was a predator who studied his prey. He was measuring her, looking for the telltale signs of a civilian out of her element, the flutter of an eyelid, the tightening of a jaw, the slight tremor in a hand. He wanted fear or, better yet, anger. Either would give him leverage. She gave him neither. She told him she was simply doing her job, a job that involved observation and documentation. Brennan took another step, closing the gap until the air between them felt electric. He spoke about her job, the one nobody could quite explain, the one that involved her hovering like a ghost with her tablet, recording their every move. He wondered aloud what she was really after. It wasn't a question, it was a challenge. Raina didn't flinch. She told him that if he had concerns, he should take them up with Colonel Whitaker. The mention of the colonel brought a flicker of something to Brennan's eyes. Not fear, but a sharpened resentment. He suggested that maybe she should just take the hint and find somewhere else to be. When Raina asked if that was a threat, Brennan's smile didn't reach his eyes. He called it friendly advice from someone who knew how the world worked. He was a general's son, a man who had grown up in the shadow of power and knew how to wield its peripheral light. Raina picked up her towel and wiped the sweat from her face, her movements methodical. She thanked him for his concern and promised to keep it in mind. As she walked out, she could feel the heat of their stares on her shoulder blades. The moment the heavy door hissed shut behind her, a burst of loud, mocking conversation erupted in the gym. Outside, the night air was cooler, but it brought no relief. Her hands were shaking, a fine tremor that she hidden until she was alone. It wasn't the shaking of a victim, it was the vibrating tension of a coiled spring. Part of her, the part that had survived 3 combat deployments and seen things that would make these cadets' blood run cold, wanted to go back in there. She wanted to show Marcus Brennan the difference between a bully and a soldier. She wanted to drop the facade and show him exactly what kind of civilian she was. But she couldn't. The mission wasn't about her ego, it was about the integrity of the program. It was about evidence. She returned to her quarters, sat in the flickering light of her desk lamp, and added every detail of the encounter into her report. Sunday was supposed to be a day of rest, a brief reprieve from the grinding tempo of base life. But Raina knew that Sunday was often when the masks slipped. People thought they were off the clock, and that's when the true nature of an organization revealed itself. She spent her morning in a focused haze, cross-referencing her notes and building a timeline of incidents. The pattern was undeniable. Brennan didn't just pick on people. He conducted a systematic dismantling of anyone he perceived as a threat or a weak link. He operated in the gray areas, the places where tough training bled into harassment, making it nearly impossible for the victims to speak out without sounding like they were whining. Around 1400, the steady hum of her concentration was broken by the buzz of her phone. It was an unrecognized number. The message was brief. "Peter's here, need to talk. Can you meet at the library alone?" Raina stared at the screen, her mind immediately jumping to tactical possibilities. It could be a trap, Brennan using Peter's phone to lure her into an isolated spot where they could intimidate her without witnesses. But it could also be the breakthrough she needed. Peters had been Brennan's primary target, the one who had suffered the most under his leadership. If he was ready to talk, the entire investigation would shift from suspicion to testimony. She messaged back a 30-minute window. The base library was a sprawling, quiet building that smelled of old glue and floor wax. On a Sunday afternoon, it was nearly empty, occupied only by a few diligent soldiers cramming for promotion boards and a clerk who seemed more interested in his fingernails than the patrons. Raina found Peters in the back, tucked away in a corner behind stacks of technical manuals. He was sitting at a study table, books spread out in a chaotic sprawl, but he wasn't reading. He was staring at a point on the wall with the 1,000-yard stare of a man who was already gone. She sat down across from him, keeping her voice low. Peters looked around nervously, his eyes darting to the ends of the aisles as if expecting an ambush. He told her he knew what she was doing. He wasn't stupid. He'd seen her watching, seen the way she showed up whenever Brennan started his games. He knew she was building a case. Raina tried to maintain her neutral professional mask, mentioning that she was just reviewing training efficiency, but Peters didn't buy it. He rubbed his face with trembling hands, looking like he hadn't slept since the training cycle began. He needed to know if her work was actually going anywhere because he was at a breaking point. He spoke about the decision he had to make, whether to quit and go home to tell his father he couldn't hack it, or to keep enduring the torment. His voice cracked as he detailed the last 6 weeks. It wasn't just the water bladder incident. Brennan had been putting rocks in his rucksack before long marches, stealing his gear so he'd be late for formation, and spreading vicious rumors about his character and sexuality. He'd made Peters a pariah among the other cadets. When Reyna asked if he had reported it, Peters gave a hollow laugh. To the instructors, Brennan was a star. To the army, he was royalty. Peters felt like a nobody whose word would carry no weight against a general's son. Reyna looked at the young man, seeing the wreckage of a promising career. She made a choice then, stepping outside her role as a neutral observer. She couldn't give him specifics, but she told him that people were taking the situation seriously. She told him that what was happening to him mattered. Peters was skeptical. He'd seen investigations that were nothing more than bureaucratic theater, designed to provide cover without actually changing anything. Reyna assured him that Colonel Whitaker wasn't that kind of man. She told him that quitting would mean Brennan had won, that the bully would have successfully shaped the world to his liking. Peters' laugh was devoid of humor. He felt like Brennan had already won. He felt weak, unable to handle the pressure that others seemed to shrug off. Reyna leaned forward, her voice becoming intense. She told him that Brennan was actually scared of him. Peters blinked in confusion. She explained that guys like Brennan couldn't understand someone who didn't quit. They understood domination, but they didn't understand resilience. Every time Peters got back up, he was proving that Brennan's power had a limit. That, she told him, was real strength. It was a good speech, and for a moment, Peters seemed to breathe a little easier. But the reality of his situation was still a crushing weight. Reyna offered him a lifeline, a way to fight back. She told him to document everything, every date, every time, every witness. She told him to put it in writing and get it to the colonel. Peters studied her, his eyes searching for an answer to a question he was almost afraid to ask. He asked who she really was, noting that she didn't carry herself like any civilian contractor he'd ever met. Reyna gave him a small, knowing smile. She told him she was someone who had been where he was, someone who was tired of watching bullies win. After Peters left, Reyna sat in the silence of the library for a long time. She felt the heavy responsibility of the promise she'd just made. She was asking a broken man to stand up against a powerful predator, and if the system failed him again, the damage would be permanent. She had to ensure the system didn't fail. That night, the atmosphere on base shifted from tense to predatory. Around 2200, Reyna was walking back to her quarters. The route took her past the edge of the training grounds, a vast expanse of dark fields and skeletal obstacle courses. The base was nearly silent, the only sound the distant, rhythmic thumping of a helicopter and the occasional hiss of tires on wet pavement. She was halfway across a wide, open plaza when she heard them. Footsteps. Multiple sets timed to stay just out of sync so they wouldn't sound like a march. She didn't speed up. She didn't look back. She simply opened her senses, the old combat muscle memory taking over. 3 people, maybe 4. They were moving to flank her, spreading out like a hunting pack. Brennan's voice came from the right, dripping with that same mock concern he'd used in the gym. He told her that walking alone this late wasn't safe. Reyna stopped and turned slowly. Brennan, Vance, and Hoskins were there, positioned in a loose semicircle that cut off her path forward. They were in their physical training gear, but their stance was anything but athletic. It was tactical. Reyna stayed calm, her voice a flat line in the dark. She told them she was fine and thanked them for their concern. Vance stepped forward, his face obscured by the shadows. He said they kept trying to be nice, trying to help her understand she wasn't wanted, but she wouldn't listen. Reyna repeated her mantra, she was just doing her job. Brennan laughed, a harsh sound that didn't belong in the quiet night. He accused her of spying, of trying to ruin their careers because of some perceived grudge against the military. He called her a bitter civilian who couldn't make it in uniform and was now trying to tear down those who could. Reyna felt her heart rate climb, but it wasn't fear. It was the cold that always came before a fight. She told them to step back. Hoskins moved closer, mocking her, asking if she was going to tell the colonel they were mean to her. The pretense of a casual encounter was gone. Brennan's voice was now sharp and dangerous. He told her she'd been a problem since the day she arrived, making the men nervous and talking to weaklings like Peters. He accused her of filling Peters' head with ideas. Reyna realized this was about more than just her presence. It was about the threat she represented to their little kingdom. They were trying to intimidate her into silence. She warned them they were making a mistake, a big one. Brennan stepped right into her personal space, the smell of stale sweat and aggression radiating off him. He told her she didn't get to threaten him. He reminded her that his father was a general, that he was destined for the special forces, and that she was a nobody. Then he poked her. It was a hard, dismissive jab to her shoulder, intended to knock her off balance and assert his physical dominance. Reyna felt the cold settle deep in her chest. Her hands remained loose, her weight centered. She told him very quietly that if he touched her again, he would find out exactly what kind of mistake he was making. Brennan's eyes widened for a split second, perhaps sensing the sudden shift in her energy, but his ego wouldn't let him back down in front of his friends. He reached out again, and this time Reyna moved. She didn't punch or kick. That would have been an escalation she couldn't afford. Instead, she used a fluid, high-level combatives maneuver, redirecting his momentum and stepping to the side in a blur of motion. It was the kind of movement that only came from thousands of hours of specialized training. Brennan stumbled, his arms swinging at empty air, his balance completely compromised. He looked at her, bewildered, as if he'd just tried to grab a shadow. Vance started to move in, but Reyna raised a hand, her voice vibrating with a command that stopped him in his tracks. She told them it was done and to walk away. For a heartbeat, the situation hung on a razor's edge. They were three and she was one, but the look in her eyes had changed. They were no longer looking at a civilian contractor. They were looking at someone who knew how to hurt them. Then, the sweeping beams of a patrol vehicle's headlights cut through the darkness. The three cadets vanished into the shadows between the buildings as if they'd never been there. Reyna stood alone in the pool of light, her heart hammering against her ribs. She had crossed a line. She had revealed her training, and Brennan was smart enough to know what that meant. The game had changed from a cat-and-mouse investigation to an open conflict. She pulled out her phone and called Whitaker, ignoring the lateness of the hour. When he answered, she told him everything. She told him the situation was escalating and that Brennan and his crew had moved from verbal harassment to physical confrontation. Whitaker was silent for a long moment, the weight of the situation clearly pressing on him. He wanted to pull her out, to end the investigation before someone got seriously hurt. But Reyna wouldn't hear of it. She knew that if she left now, Brennan would win, the reports would be buried, and Peters would be crushed. She asked for 48 more hours. She felt something building, a final collision that would expose the rot in the program once and for all. Whitaker eventually agreed, but only on the condition that she stay in public areas and keep an MP escort nearby. The next morning, the tension on the base was thick enough to taste. Reyna showed up at the obstacle course at 0700, tablet in hand, maintaining her role despite the events of the previous night. Brennan was there, leading a group through pull-up drills. When he saw her, he dropped from the bar and walked over. His demeanor had changed. He wasn't loud or boastful anymore. He looked at her with a new kind of intensity. He told her he'd seen the way she moved. He knew she had real training, high-level military combatives. He'd been busy. He'd used his father's name to make calls, to dig into her background. He told her that her credentials were thin, that they looked like a legend built for an operative. He'd guessed she was an inspector general plant, sent to find dirt because of some washout's complaint. He told her she was out of her depth and that she should pack her bags and leave today. If she didn't, he guaranteed that things would get ugly. Reyna didn't argue. She knew that his calls to his father would eventually reach the upper echelons of the command structure. The window of opportunity was closing faster than she'd anticipated. She found Peters during the lunch rush, catching him outside the mess hall. She told him she needed his documentation by 1600. Peters was hesitant, sensing the frantic energy of the situation, but Reyna urged him to move. She told him that if he wanted his voice to be heard, it had to be now, before the entire investigation was shut down by outside pressure. By 15:30, the call she had been dreading finally came. It was Whitaker, and his voice was tight with stress. He told her to get to his office immediately. When she arrived, she found the colonel pacing, his face lined with exhaustion. General Brennan had called. The general wanted to know why an unknown civilian was conducting a witch hunt against his son. He was flying in the next day to meet with Whitaker and see all the documentation. He was coming to protect his legacy. Whitaker told Reyna the investigation was over. He couldn't fight a 3-star general without ironclad evidence, and all they had were reports and the testimony of a cadet who would be branded as disgruntled. He was pulling her out for her own safety and to save his own career. Reyna tried to argue, pointing out that pulling the plug now would destroy Peters and allow Brennan to continue his path of destruction. She said that General Brennan would burn the place down to protect his son. Whitaker's voice cracked as he admitted he believed her, but belief wasn't enough in a system designed to protect the powerful. Reyna stood her ground. She asked for one more night. She had a plan to force Brennan into a mistake so public and so undeniable that even his father couldn't cover for it. She wanted to give Brennan exactly what he wanted, a confrontation on his terms, but with witnesses he couldn't intimidate. Whitaker stared at her, calling the plan insane, but eventually he gave her the green light. He told her to be smart and to come out in one piece. Raina spent the evening in her quarters, the silence of the room amplifying the ticking of the clock. She prepared herself as if she were going back into the field. She changed into dark, functional clothing and strapped on her old tactical watch, the one with the emergency beacon. At 23:15, her phone buzzed with an anonymous text. "Rooftop, Malvesty Hall, midnight. Come alone if you want answers." It was the trap she'd been waiting for. She forwarded the message to Whitaker, telling him to send help if he didn't hear from her by 0100. She approached Malvesty Hall from the shadows, avoiding the obvious routes. She didn't use the fire escape. Instead, she moved through the interior of the building, her footsteps silent on the concrete stairs. The door to the roof was propped open, a blatant invitation. She stepped out into the cool night air, the wind whipping around the edges of the building. 4 figures were waiting for her: Brennan, Vance, Hoskins, and Chen. They had her flanked, blocking the only exit. They were in civilian clothes, looking like a street gang rather than future officers. Brennan stepped forward, surprised that she'd actually shown up. Raina countered that it would have been rude to decline. Brennan moved closer, the other 3 shifting to close the circle. He told her this was the end of her investigation, the place where she would learn about consequences. Raina kept her breathing steady, her eyes tracking every movement in the dark. She asked if they were planning to assault her, but Vance laughed, saying they were just having a conversation. Chen spoke up, accusing her of filling Peter's head with lies. Brennan corrected him, saying it didn't matter what she'd said. What mattered was that she was a problem that needed to be solved. Hoskins suggested that she might have an accident tonight, a tragic fall from a rooftop where she had no business being. The base would investigate, find she was out of line, and chalk it up to poor judgment. It was a cold, calculated plan. Brennan smiled, telling her they had gotten very good at planning. He seemed confident, buoyed by the darkness and the presence of his loyal followers. He believed he was in control, but he had no idea that he was stepping into a trap of his own making, a moment that would finally bring the light of accountability into the shadows of his reign. The wind gusted across the rooftop, carrying the scent of rain and the distant hum of the base. Raina could feel the eyes of the 4 men on her, heavy with a mixture of malice and a strange, flickering uncertainty. They were waiting for her to break, to plead, or to run. But she stood still, a dark silhouette against the pale glow of the city lights on the horizon. Brennan took another step, his shadow stretching long across the gravel-covered roof. He began to talk about his father, about the legacy he was born to carry, and how people like Raina were just speed bumps on his road to power. He spoke with a sense of destiny that bordered on delusion, a conviction that the rules of ordinary men simply didn't apply to him. He was a creature of the institution, fed by its secrets and protected by its walls. Raina listened, letting him talk. Every word he spoke was another piece of evidence, another brick in the wall she was building around him. She knew that Whitaker was listening, that the emergency beacon on her watch was transmitting her location and the audio of the confrontation. She just needed him to go a little further, to make the threat explicit and the intent undeniable. She asked him if he really thought his father could protect him from everything. Brennan's face twisted into a sneer. He told her his father was the army and that she was nothing more than a ghost. He reached out, his hand closing around her upper arm, his grip bruisingly tight. He told her it was time for her to go. In that moment, the air seemed to freeze. Raina didn't pull away. She looked down at his hand, then back up at his eyes. She told him he had just made his last mistake. Brennan started to laugh, but the sound died in his throat as a searchlight suddenly erupted from the darkness, bathing the rooftop in a blinding, white glare. From the shadows of the stairwell and the edges of the roof, figures moved in, not cadets but MPs, their weapons drawn and their voices authoritative. Brennan's grip slackened, his face going pale in the artificial light. He looked around wildly, seeing the trap for what it was. Whitaker stepped forward into the light, his face a mask of cold fury. He didn't look at Raina, he looked directly at Brennan. He told the young man that the conversation was over. As the MPs moved in to detain the 4 cadets, Raina finally allowed herself to let out a long, slow breath. The tension that had been coiled in her chest for weeks began to unravel. She watched as Brennan was led away, his bravado replaced by a stunned, hollow silence. He looked at her one last time, a flicker of realization in his eyes. He had finally met someone he couldn't break. Raina walked to the edge of the roof, looking out over the base. The lights of Fort Benning stretched out below her, a vast grid of order and discipline. The investigation wasn't over. There would be hearings, testimonies, and the inevitable fallout of a general's son facing justice. But for the first time since she'd arrived, the air felt clear. She had done her job. She had documented the truth, and in the end, the truth had been enough. She reached into her pocket, felt the familiar weight of her tablet, and began to think about the final report she would write. A report that would ensure that people like Peters would never have to walk in the shadows again. The wind on the roof of Malvesty Hall was colder than it had any right to be for a Georgia night, whipping across the flat expanse with a low, mournful howl that seemed to underscore the gravity of the situation. Raina stood her ground, her boots planted firmly on the gravel-covered surface, while the 4 cadets circled her like a pack of wolves that had finally cornered their prey. Brennan was at the center of it all, his face illuminated by the distant, flickering glow of the base perimeter lights. There was a sickening kind of pride in his expression, the look of a man who believed his birthright made him invincible. He spoke of their long history of covering tracks, of Peter's sabotaged water bladder and the ammunition mix-ups that had plagued the training cycle. He spoke of these things not with shame, but as if they were tactical masterstrokes, little accidents that nobody could ever prove. Raina watched him, her mind working with the cold, calculated precision of a seasoned operative. Every word he uttered was a nail in his own coffin, a confession of sabotage, assault, and conspiracy. She felt the weight of her watch on her wrist, a piece of technology that was far more than a simple timepiece. Her fingers brushed against the edge of the casing, finding the small, recessed button that served as her emergency beacon. She knew the protocol. One firm press held for 3 seconds would send an encrypted signal directly to Colonel Whitaker's private receiver. It would include her GPS coordinates and a distress code that would bypass standard dispatch. But she couldn't press it yet. She needed him to keep talking. She needed the arrogance of a general's son to override his survival instinct until he had incriminated himself beyond any hope of redemption. "What about Peters?" she asked, her voice steady despite the adrenaline surging through her veins. She needed to know how deep the rot went, what they intended for the young man who had dared to stand up to them. Brennan's grin widened, a jagged flash of white in the darkness. He explained with chilling nonchalance that Peters was going to quit, tomorrow most likely. They had been leaning on him for weeks, eroding his resolve and his sanity until he was at the breaking point. If he walked away, anything he said later would be dismissed as the bitter rambling of a failure, a sore loser with a grudge. And if he didn't? Brennan's shrug was casual, almost bored. They would just keep pushing until he either broke or had an accident of his own. "Problem solved," he'd said, as if he were discussing clearing a jammed rifle rather than destroying a human life. That was the moment Raina pressed the beacon. 1 second, 2 seconds, 3. A tiny vibration against her skin confirmed the message was sent. The silent cry for help was out there, racing through the digital ether to the one man on base who could actually do something about this. Now the mission parameters had shifted. She no longer needed to gather intel. She just had to stay alive long enough for the cavalry to arrive. She looked at Brennan, seeing the shadow of his father, the 3-star general, looming behind him. She warned him that he was making a massive mistake, that he was operating under the delusion that his father's rank was a shield that could never be pierced. But Brennan only laughed, a harsh, grating sound that was lost to the wind. To him, she was a middle-aged civilian woman, a glorified secretary who spent her days taking notes. She was an annoyance to be eliminated, not a threat to be feared. He gave a sharp nod to Vance and Hoskins, and the 2 larger cadets began to move, their movements practiced and coordinated. They were boxing her in, herding her toward the edge of the roof. Raina backed up slowly, her mind mapping the terrain. The roof was a 60 by 40-foot rectangle of flat concrete and gravel, bounded by a 3-foot parapet wall. Beyond that wall was a 6-story drop to the unforgiving concrete and manicured landscaping of the courtyard below. Brennan offered her one last chance to walk away, to leave Fort Benning that night and bury everything she'd seen. If she left, Peters would no longer be her problem. But Raina wasn't built for retreat. She reached the parapet, the cold stone pressing into her lower back, and told him firmly that she wasn't leaving and she wasn't forgetting. The attack came faster than she expected. Brennan rushed her, his face contorted with a sudden, feral rage. He moved to shove her backward, intending to let gravity do the work of a murderer. But he had made the fatal error of assuming she was exactly what she appeared to be. At the last possible second, Reyna twisted her torso, using his own momentum against him. She redirected the force of his shove, stepping aside as he stumbled past her, his hand slapping hard against the concrete wall as he narrowly avoided going over himself. When he spun back around, the arrogance was gone, replaced by a pure, unadulterated snarl of fury. He told her she had just made it personal, and the air in the rooftop grew even colder. Vance came at her from the left while Hoskins closed in from the right. Reyna had a split second to make a tactical decision that would define the rest of her life. She could fight back. She could use the hand-to-hand combat skills she had mastered over decades of elite service to break their limbs and leave them gasping on the gravel. But if she did that, the narrative would change. It would be her word against 4 of the Army's best and brightest cadets. It would be a civilian woman assaulting soldiers. The charges might stick to her instead of them. To win this war, she had to be the victim of their intent. So she did the only thing that made sense. She didn't fall backward. She went over the wall on her own terms. She grabbed the top of the parapet, her fingers digging into the rough concrete, and swung her legs into the void. She dropped into a controlled hang, her entire body weight supported by her grip on the ledge. Below her, 6 stories of empty air yawned like an open grave, the distant ground a dark, blurred reality. But Reyna didn't panic. She had done this 1,000 times before, high-altitude insertions, scaling urban structures in the dead of night, and every grueling vertical challenge the Navy could devise for a SEAL candidate. Above her, she heard Brennan's muffled oath of confusion. He hadn't expected her to survive the first push, let alone have the strength and presence of mind to hang there. She hung in the darkness, her arms extended, her breathing rhythmic and controlled. She focused on the feeling of the concrete beneath her fingertips, the texture of the stone, the way her watch dug into her wrist. The beacon was still active, still pulsing her location to Whitaker. All she had to do was hold on. Hoskins' voice drifted over the edge, sounding genuinely shocked. He couldn't believe she was actually hanging there. But Brennan's response was immediate and cold. He told them to push her off. He wanted it finished. Reyna felt the vibration of footsteps through the wall, a heavy thrumming that signaled someone was approaching the edge. Vance's face appeared above her, his features twisted in a mask of grim determination. He told her to let go, that she couldn't hold on forever. Reyna looked him straight in the eye and told him to watch her. He reached down, his large hands wrapping around her right wrist, and began to pry at her fingers. Pain flared through her hand as he bent her fingers back, trying to snap her grip on the ledge. It was a searing, white-hot agony, but Reyna didn't let out a sound. She shifted her weight, putting the burden on her left hand, and brought her right knee up with a surge of core strength, hooking her foot over the edge of the parapet. Now she had 3 points of contact, locking herself to the building like a spider. Vance grunted with the effort, pulling harder, but she was an anchor. Every second she stayed alive was another second closer to the arrival of the MPs. She just had to endure. Then Brennan's face appeared next to Vance's, his eyes narrowing as he realized she wasn't just some civilian who had gotten lucky. He admitted she was tougher than she looked, but maintained that it wouldn't change the outcome. He told her she was still going to fall. Reyna countered by asking him if he really wanted his legacy to be a murder in front of witnesses. Brennan laughed at that, gesturing to the empty rooftop. He claimed there were no witnesses, just 4 soldiers who would tell the same story. A crazy civilian woman had attacked them, they had defended themselves, and she had gone over the edge in the struggle. Self-defense. No charges. Reyna's left hand was starting to slip as sweat made the concrete slick. She redistributed her weight again, buying herself a few more precious seconds of life. She challenged him, asking if he really thought investigators would be that stupid. Brennan's response was a chilling reminder of the power he wielded. He didn't care if they were stupid. He cared that his father was a 3-star general with connections that reached all the way to the Pentagon. He believed that investigations found exactly what they were told to find. He reached down and grabbed her left wrist, twisting her arm with a brutality that threatened to tear her shoulder from its socket. He told her to let go or he would make it hurt worse than it had to. Her options were thinning out. She could pull herself up and end the charade, but she needed them to cross the line so completely that even a general couldn't save them. She needed them to commit to the act of killing. So she let go with her right hand. She dropped 6 inches, the sudden jerk jarring her entire frame before catching herself again, now hanging by only her left hand and one hooked foot. The sudden movement startled Brennan, making him lose his grip on her wrist. He pulled back, his eyes wide. From somewhere behind him, Chen's voice shook as he called her insane. Hoskins echoed the sentiment, doubt finally beginning to creep into his tone. He suggested they should just leave her, call the whole thing off. But Brennan was too far gone. He told them they were committed. They were going to finish this. Yet he didn't move. He just stared down at her, and for the first time, Raina saw confusion in his eyes. He didn't understand why she wasn't begging. He didn't understand why there was no panic, no screaming, no fear. He asked her quietly what she was. Raina shifted her weight, her left arm feeling like it was filled with liquid fire. She had 20 seconds left, maybe 30, before her muscles simply gave out. She told him the truth. She told him she was someone who had been in situations far worse than this. Someone who had hung from helicopters over hostile territory, who had climbed buildings in Baghdad and Kabul, in places he had never even heard of. She told him she was a SEAL. The word hung in the air, heavy and jagged. Realization crashed over Brennan's face like a physical blow. A SEAL. Not a civilian, not a contractor, but Navy special warfare. Vance took a panicked step back from the edge, his voice cracking as he realized they hadn't just assaulted a civilian, they had attempted to murder a commissioned officer. Raina corrected him, emphasizing the attempted murder part of the charges. Chen sounded like he was on the verge of a breakdown, whispering that they were screwed, but Brennan snapped at them to shut up. He was still calculating, still trying to find a way to win. He challenged her to prove it, to pull herself up if she was really what she claimed to be. Raina refused. She told him she was fine right where she was. She told him that help was already on the way, that she had triggered a beacon the moment she reached the roof. She told him Colonel Whitaker knew exactly where she was and that security forces were likely already in the building. It was a bluff. She didn't know exactly how close the MPs were, but it was a masterful one. Brennan's eyes darted toward the roof access door, the mask of the untouchable general's son finally beginning to crack. He accused her of lying, but he didn't look like he believed his own words. Hoskins didn't wait to find out. He started moving toward the door, declaring he was out and wasn't going down for this. Brennan tried to rally them, suggesting they could still make it look like an accident, but Vance shot him down. The idea of pushing a SEAL off a roof after she had already signaled for help was suicide. Raina's hand was shaking violently now, her entire arm trembling under the strain. She had maybe 10 seconds left. She could have ended it then, but she waited, letting them stew in their own terror for a few heartbeats longer. Finally, with a grunt of pure willpower, she pulled herself up. It wasn't the graceful, effortless movement of a movie hero. It was the raw, grinding effort of a woman whose muscles were screaming in protest. She hauled herself over the parapet and rolled onto the gravel, coming up on her feet in a defensive crouch. Without a word, she pulled up her sleeve, revealing the Navy SEAL trident tattooed on her forearm. Black ink against pale skin, a symbol of a world these cadets had only ever dreamed of entering. Vance whispered an oath of disbelief. Brennan stared at the ink as if it were a predator waiting to strike. All the arrogance had drained from his face, leaving him pale and hollow. He accused her of setting them up, but Raina corrected him again. She hadn't set them up. She had simply given them enough rope to hang themselves by being exactly who they were. The roof access door didn't just open. It slammed against the wall as Colonel Whitaker burst through, followed by 4 MPs with their weapons drawn and ready. They fanned out across the roof, their movements sharp and professional. Whitaker's eyes locked onto Raina immediately, calling her Lieutenant Thorne and asking if she was injured. The use of her rank was the final blow to the cadets' delusions. Raina stood tall, her voice clear as she reported that the 4 cadets had attempted to murder a commissioned officer during an official investigation. The MPs moved in, forcing Brennan and his crew to the ground. Vance and Chen collapsed immediately, their hands behind their heads in total submission. Hoskins hesitated for a second, his eyes darting around like a trapped animal before he too surrendered. Brennan was the only one who remained standing for a moment longer. He invoked his father's name again, claiming they didn't have the authority to arrest him. Whitaker stepped into his personal space, his face looking as though it had been carved from granite. He told Brennan that he had every bit of authority needed, especially after an attempted murder. He ordered him to the ground, his voice leaving no room for argument. Reyna watched as Brennan's world finally shattered. The realization that his father's stars couldn't reach him here in this moment seemed to break something inside him. He dropped to his knees, and the MPs moved in with zip ties, the plastic clicking rhythmically as they secured his wrists. As they led him away, Brennan looked back at Reyna, his eyes burning with a loathing that was pure and undiluted. He told her she had ruined his life, that everything he had worked for was gone. Reyna's response was quiet, devoid of the anger he expected. She told him he had ruined his own life. She had just ensured there were consequences for it. Whitaker walked over to her once the cadets were being escorted down the stairs. He looked at the ledge, then back at her, shaking his head in disbelief. He told her that hanging off a building for a confession was the most insane thing he'd heard in 26 years of service. He asked if she was hurt, noticing the blood on her hands where the concrete had chewed through her skin. Reyna looked at her palms, which were raw and stinging, but she shrugged it off. She'd had worse, she told him. Whitaker pulled out his phone, his expression turning grim. He had to call General Brennan, a conversation he predicted would be the worst of his career. Reyna offered to do it for him, but Whitaker declined. It was his responsibility as the commanding officer. He looked at her with a mix of respect and exhaustion, calling what she did brave and stupid in the same breath. Reyna noted that sometimes they were the same thing. As Whitaker stepped away to make the call, Reyna walked back to the edge of the roof, looking out over the sprawling expanse of Fort Benning. Below, the base was waking up. Lights were flickering on in the barracks as the news of the arrest began to ripple through the ranks. MPs were setting up a perimeter around Malvesti Hall, their sirens a distant, wailing chorus. Her phone buzzed in her pocket, a text from Peters. He had heard something was happening and wanted to know if she was okay. She typed back a quick reply, telling him she was fine and that he didn't have to quit. It was over. The thank you that came back a moment later felt more significant than any medal she'd ever earned. Whitaker returned a few minutes later, his face looking even more haggard. The general was already on his way, flying in that night and demanding a meeting at 0600. The conversation had gone as poorly as expected. Threats against Whitaker's career, demands to see evidence, and a flat-out refusal to believe his son was capable of such things. Whitaker had held his ground, informing the general that they had witnesses, testimony, and a recording. Reyna turned to him, surprised by the last detail. Whitaker allowed himself a small, smug smile. He hadn't sent her up there without backup. He had positioned an MP with a directional microphone on the adjacent building. They had captured every word, every threat, and every confession. But the victory was tempered by reality. Whitaker warned her that the general would fight this with every weapon in his arsenal. He would try to discredit her, dismantle the investigation, and call in every favor owed to him at the Pentagon. Reyna wasn't intimidated. She told him to let the general try, that the evidence was solid. But Whitaker knew the world of high-stakes military politics better than she did. He knew that evidence didn't always matter when you were dealing with people who had spent decades building empires. Reyna thought about all the times she had seen the system protect the powerful, but then she thought about Peters and the other cadets whose lives had been derailed by Brennan's cruelty. She told Whitaker they would make it matter this time. They would take it to the top. They spent the remaining hours of the night in Whitaker's office, a cramped space that smelled of stale coffee and old paper. They laid out the documentation like a battle plan, Reyna's detailed, time-stamped notes, Peter's testimony, and reports from other cadets who had finally found the courage to speak up now that the predator was behind bars. The pattern of abuse was undeniable, a systematic campaign of terror that had been allowed to flourish under the protection of a famous name. At 0400, Whitaker brewed a pot of coffee that was strong enough to peel paint, and they kept working, refining their presentation for the inevitable confrontation. At 0500, the phone rang. It was the general. He was early. Whitaker put him on speaker, and the general's voice filled the room, hard, cold, and dripping with command authority. He was outside the headquarters building and demanded the meeting start immediately. He also demanded that the SEAL be present so he could look her in the eye while she explained why she was trying to destroy his son. Reyna leaned toward the phone, her voice calm and lethal. She told the general she was happy to explain everything and that she looked forward to seeing him. The line went dead. They walked down to the conference room together, Reyna feeling a different kind of adrenaline now. This wasn't the physical danger of the rooftop. This was the institutional danger of a man who could end careers with a single phone call. General Marcus Brennan Sr. was waiting for them, and the resemblance to his son was striking. He had the same broad shoulders and the same aura of someone who expected the world to bend to his will, but his eyes were like chips of ice. He didn't offer a hand. He didn't offer a seat. He went straight for the jugular, calling her rank an insult and demanding to know why his son was in a holding cell. Raina didn't blink. She told him his son was in a cell because he tried to kill her and because he was a bully who had been systematically breaking the men under his command. The general dismissed her words as a setup, claiming she had targeted his son because of the Brennan name. Whitaker stepped in, correcting him. They hadn't targeted the son because of the father. They had targeted the son because he was a predator in uniform. The general countered by calling his son a strong leader who simply made enemies of weak subordinates. Raina leaned forward, her voice dropping to a low, dangerous register. She told him his son wasn't a leader. He was a coward who hid behind his father's stars. She warned him that if he used his power to protect his son now, he would be responsible for the next person the boy hurt. The general's jaw tightened, a muscle leaping in his cheek. He told her she didn't get to lecture him on responsibility after his 30 years of service. Raina shot back that she had served for 20, and in that time she had seen exactly what happened when people like his son were protected. They didn't stop. They escalated until they finally got someone killed. She reminded him that his son had watched her hang from a ledge and tried to pry her fingers off. That was attempted murder, born of the belief that he would never have to answer for it. The silence that followed was heavy, suffocating. Finally, the general stood up and announced he would be filing a complaint against the investigation and calling the Secretary of the Army. Whitaker told him to do what he had to, but the court-martial was non-negotiable. As the general walked to the door, he paused and told Raina she had made a powerful enemy. Raina met his gaze with a level of coldness that matched his own. She told him she had made powerful enemies before and was still standing. After he left, Whitaker exhaled a breath he seemed to have been holding for an hour. He warned her that this would follow her, that the general would make her pay for this. Raina told him she could handle it, but Whitaker wasn't so sure. He knew the reach of a 3-star general. Before they could even process the meeting, Whitaker's phone rang again. It was the base commander, Brigadier General Carson. The general had already called him from his car. Whitaker put it on speaker, and Carson's voice was a storm of barely controlled fury. He had been told that Whitaker had arrested a general's son on fabricated charges, using a rogue seal. Whitaker calmly corrected the narrative, explaining that Raina was authorized and that they had a confession for attempted murder. The silence on the other end of the line was deafening as Carson processed the word murder. He ordered them both to his office at 0700, demanding every piece of evidence they had. He warned them that if this wasn't airtight, he would bury them so deep they'd need a map to find daylight. Whitaker set the phone down and looked at Raina. They had 45 minutes. They spent every one of those minutes perfecting the file. They organized Raina's notes, Peter's signed testimony, and the audio recording into a digital and physical presentation that was undeniable. Raina looked at her torn palms one last time, the blood now dried and dark. She felt a strange sense of peace. The fight wasn't over. In many ways, the real war was just beginning, but the silence of the rooftop had been replaced by the noise of justice. They walked out of the office and toward the commander's headquarters, 2 officers ready to stand their ground against the weight of a legacy that had finally outrun its shadow. The morning air at Fort Benning carried the sharp, biting scent of pine and damp earth, a fragrance that usually signaled a fresh start for the thousands of soldiers stationed there. But for Lieutenant Raina Thorne, the beauty of the sunrise felt like a thin veneer of gold leaf applied over a rusted, decaying structure. As the sun began to crest the horizon at 0650 hours, it cast long, dramatic shadows across the pavement, painting the brick buildings of the base in warm shades of orange and amber. To any outsider, it was a picture-perfect military morning, the very image of discipline and order. Raina knew better. She looked at the polished brass on the doors of the commander's building and felt a cold weight in her stomach. She was carrying enough evidence to dismantle careers, and she knew that once she stepped through those doors, there was no turning back. Beside her, Colonel Whitaker walked with a grim, rhythmic stride. His face was a mask of professional neutrality, but Raina could see the tension in the way he held his laptop case. his knuckles slightly white against the leather handle. They had spent the last several hours reviewing the statements from 3 other cadets, young men who had finally found their courage after learning of Marcus Brennan's arrest. Their stories were harrowing, a repetitive cycle of intimidation and cruelty that had been allowed to fester in the shadows of the Ranger program. But the real hammer in their arsenal was the recording from the rooftop. It was clear, hauntingly so. Brennan's voice was unmistakable, devoid of the charm he used on his superiors, replaced by a cold, predatory confidence as he threatened Reyna's life and casually confessed to a string of previous accidents. The heavy glass doors hissed shut behind them, cutting off the awakening sounds of the base. Inside, the atmosphere was hushed and sterile, the air-conditioned chill a stark contrast to the humid Georgia morning. General Carson's aide, a young captain with a perfectly pressed uniform and a neutral expression, met them in the foyer. He didn't offer a greeting beyond a curt nod before leading them down a hallway lined with portraits of past commanders. Their eyes seemed to follow Reyna, a silent gallery of men who had built the very traditions she was about to challenge. The aide gestured toward a heavy oak door at the end of the hall and stepped aside, allowing them to enter the inner sanctum of the base's power. General Carson was already there, seated at the head of a long, polished conference table. He was a man who looked as though he had been carved out of granite, mid-50s, career infantry, with a weathered face marked by deep lines earned from decades of hard decisions in unforgiving places. He didn't rise when they entered. He simply stared at them over the rim of a steaming mug of coffee, his uniform crisp and devoid of a single wrinkle despite the early hour. The silence in the room was thick, broken only by the hum of the overhead lights. Carson didn't bother with pleasantries. He didn't ask how they were or offer them a seat. He simply looked at the clock on the wall, then back at Whitaker. "Sit," the general said, his voice a low, gravelly rumble that commanded instant obedience. "Start talking." Whitaker didn't hesitate. He took his seat and flipped open his laptop, the blue light of the screen reflecting in his tired eyes. He pulled up the first series of documents, a chronological log of the complaints they had been tracking. "Sir, 3 months ago, my office began receiving a series of complaints regarding the training culture within the Ranger program. At first, it was nothing concrete. No names, no dates, just a recurring pattern of cadets washing out and citing harassment, intimidation, and a pervasive toxic environment. We see washouts complain all the time, sir. It's part of the process. But these felt different. They were too consistent." Carson grunted, a sound of skeptical agreement. "Washouts always have an excuse. They want to blame the instructors, the weather, the equipment, anything but their own lack of grit. That's not news, Colonel. That's Tuesday." "Agreed, sir," Whitaker said, his tone unwavering. "Which is why I brought in Lieutenant Thorne to conduct an independent, boots-on-the-ground assessment. Her orders were simple but difficult. Observe the program from the inside without identifying herself. I wanted to see what really happens when nobody thinks they're being watched by the brass. I wanted the unvarnished truth." Carson shifted his gaze to Reyna. His eyes were piercing, the kind of eyes that could see through a soldier's bravado and find the fear underneath. "And what did you see, Lieutenant? Tell me what justified this kind of shadow operation." Reyna met his stare head-on. She had faced down enemy combatants in the mountains of Afghanistan and navigated the murky waters of special operations politics. She wasn't about to blink now. "I saw systematic abuse, sir. I saw a group of cadets, led by Marcus Brennan, who had turned the most prestigious training program in the Army into their own personal playground for cruelty. They targeted anyone they perceived as weak or outside their social circle. They sabotaged equipment, they spread rumors designed to destroy reputations, and they created an environment of fear that had nothing to do with military discipline and everything to do with psychopathic ego. Over the course of 7 days, I documented 14 separate incidents of actionable misconduct." 14 incidents. Carson's jaw tightened, his brow furrowing. "And you're telling me you sat back and watched? You didn't intervene once?" "My orders were to document the full scope of the problem, General," Reyna replied, her voice steady. "If I had shut down the first incident, a slashed water bladder or a few stolen rounds of ammunition, we would have caught a bully. By letting it play out, we caught a criminal. If I had stepped in too early, we would never have seen how deep the rot went or how many people were complicit in looking the other way. I had to let them think they were safe so they would show me exactly who they were." Carson leaned back, his chair creaking under his weight. He rubbed his chin, his eyes never leaving hers. "Walk me through it." Every incident from the start to the end. I want the details, Lieutenant. Don't leave anything out. For the next hour, Raina took him through the grim reality of the past week. She described the way Cadet Peters had discovered his water bladder was slashed in the middle of a grueling 12-mile ruck march, forcing him to choose between dehydration or failure. She detailed the late-night poker games in the barracks where Brennan would brag about his tactics, treating the destruction of his peers' careers like a game of strategy. She spoke of the confrontation in the gym, the whispers in the dark, and the escalating threats that had culminated on the roof of the training building. When she reached the part of the narrative where she found herself dangling over the edge of a 6-story drop, Carson held up a hand. "Stop," he commanded. He looked at her as if she were a puzzle he couldn't quite solve. "You're telling me you voluntarily went over the side of that building? You put yourself in a position where your life depended on your grip and a few inches of concrete." "It was a tactically sound decision at the time, sir," Raina said. "Tactically sound?" Carson's voice rose an octave, a rare show of emotion. "That's not tactically sound, Lieutenant. That's insane. You could have been killed before you even hit the ground." "I needed them to commit fully, sir," Raina explained, her voice calm despite the general's outburst. "I needed them to cross the line so completely that there would be no room for excuses, no way for their lawyers to claim it was just a prank gone wrong or a misunderstanding. I needed them to believe they had succeeded in murder so they would speak freely about it. If I had stayed on that roof and fought them, it would have been my word against 4 of them. By going over the edge, I forced them to reveal their true intent. It worked." Carson stared at her for a long, uncomfortable moment, his expression unreadable. Finally, he turned to Whitaker. "Play me the recording." Whitaker clicked a file on his laptop. The room was suddenly filled with the sound of wind whipping across a rooftop, followed by the heavy, confident footsteps of Marcus Brennan. As the recording played, the atmosphere in the conference room grew cold. Brennan's voice was chillingly detached as he explained the accident they had planned for Raina. He spoke about the sabotage of Peters with a laugh, and then his voice turned sharp and lethal as he threatened Raina. The casual cruelty of it, the complete lack of remorse or hesitation, seemed to echo off the walls. When the recording ended with the sound of the confrontation and Raina's simulated fall, the silence that followed was deafening. Carson sat back, his face having shifted from skeptical to granite hard. He looked like a man who had just seen a ghost, or perhaps something worse, the failure of his own institution. "Does General Brennan know about this recording?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. "He does, sir," Whitaker replied. "We played it for him this morning, shortly after the arrest was processed." "And his response?" "He called it a setup," Whitaker said, a hint of bitterness creeping into his voice. "He claimed we targeted his son specifically because of his family name. He's already threatening to involve the Pentagon." Carson rubbed his face with both hands, a gesture of deep weariness. "Of course he did. Marcus has been protecting that boy since he was old enough to walk. Every screw-up, every failed test, every incident in prep school, Daddy made it go away. He's built a wall of protection around that kid that he thinks is impenetrable." He looked at Whitaker, his eyes sharp again. "You know what happens if we proceed with this, right? General Brennan doesn't just have 3 stars on his shoulders. He's got friends in the halls of Congress and connections at the highest levels of the Pentagon. He can make our lives very, very complicated. He can end careers with a phone call." "I'm aware of the risks, sir," Whitaker said. "And you still want to move forward." "I don't see how we have a choice," Whitaker replied firmly. "That recording is proof of attempted murder and a conspiracy to commit a felony. If we ignore this because of a man's rank, we aren't just failing these cadets, we're failing the entire army. We're telling every soldier that the rules only apply to those without the right last name." Carson turned his gaze back to Raina. "What about you, Lieutenant? You're not even Army. You're Navy Reserves on a special assignment. You could walk away from this right now. You could hand over your notes, catch a flight back to whatever civilian life you were living, and let us handle this internally. No risk to your reputation, no legal battles, no General Brennan breathing down your neck. Why stay?" Raina thought about the offer. It was tempting. She could leave the humidity of Georgia behind, return to her quiet life, and forget she ever heard the name Marcus Brennan. But then she thought about Cadet Peters. She thought about the way his voice had cracked in the dining hall when he asked if anyone would actually listen, the look of profound, hopeless exhaustion in his eyes. She thought about the 14 incidents she had witnessed, the small, incremental ways a group of bullies had tried to break the spirits of good men. I'm not walking away, sir, Reyna said. Those cadets deserve better than what they've been getting. They came here to become rangers, to serve their country. Instead, they were treated like prey. If Cadet Brennan doesn't face consequences for what he did, the message to every other bully in uniform is clear. You can do whatever you want, you can even try to kill a fellow soldier, as long as your father has enough rank to cover it up. I won't be a part of that. A small, grim smile touched Carson's lips, though there was no humor in it. You've got steel in you, Lieutenant. I'll give you that. Most people would have taken the exit. He stood up, smoothing his tunic with a sharp, decisive motion. All right, here's what's going to happen. I'm not waiting for the Pentagon to find a way to bury this. I'm convening an Article 32 hearing for this afternoon, 1400 hours. Cadet Brennan and his 3 accomplices will face preliminary charges of attempted murder, conspiracy, assault, and conduct unbecoming an officer. The hearing officer will determine if there's enough evidence to proceed to a full court-martial. Whitaker looked surprised. That's incredibly fast, sir. We usually have days, if not weeks, to prepare for a 32. It needs to be fast, Carson snapped. Once word of this gets out, and it will get out probably by lunchtime, we're going to have the media crawling all over this base. General Brennan will have his PR team and his legal vultures circling us before sunset. Our only hope is to move quickly, establish the facts on the record, and make it impossible for them to sweep this under the rug. We establish the narrative now, or they do it for us. He looked at Reyna. You'll need to testify. Are you prepared for that? Yes, sir. It won't be pleasant, Carson warned. Brennan's lawyer, whoever he hires, is going to come after you with everything they've got. They'll attack your credibility, your methods, your entire background. They're going to try to paint you as a rogue agent with a vendetta against young soldiers. They will try to tear you apart in front of that hearing officer. Reyna didn't flinch. Let them try, sir. Carson nodded, a flicker of respect in his eyes. Dismissed. Both of you be back here at 13:30 for a pre-hearing briefing, and stay off the radar until then. They walked out into the morning sun, which was now higher and hotter, casting a harsh glare over the base. The weight of the coming hours settled onto Reyna's shoulders like a physical burden. An Article 32 hearing wasn't a full trial yet. It was more like a grand jury proceeding. But in a case this high profile, it would feel like one. If Brennan's lawyer was as good as she expected, things were about to get incredibly ugly. Whitaker checked his watch, his face etched with concern. We've got 6 hours. You should eat something, maybe try to get an hour of sleep. You're going to need your wits about you. I need to talk to Peters first, Reyna said. He deserves to know what's happening. He's the one who has to live with the fallout of this more than anyone. She found Peters in the dining facility, a vast, echoing hall filled with the clatter of trays and the low murmur of tired cadets. He was sitting alone at a corner table, staring blankly at a tray of scrambled eggs and cold toast that he hadn't touched. He looked smaller than he had the day before, his shoulders slumped as if the weight of the world were resting on them. When Reyna approached, he looked up, and a wave of visible relief flooded his face. Lieutenant Thorne, he whispered, standing up so quickly his chair scraped loudly against the floor. I heard they arrested them. I heard you were okay, but I needed to see for myself. I didn't know if. Reyna sat down across from him, gesturing for him to stay seated. I'm fine, Peters, better than fine. We've been with General Carson all morning. There's an Article 32 hearing scheduled for this afternoon. Brennan and his crew are facing formal charges. Peters' eyes went wide, his mouth hanging open slightly. Seriously, they're actually going to prosecute him? His dad is a 3-star, I thought. I thought they'd just send him to another base or something. Not this time, Reyna said, her voice low and serious. But I need you to understand something. You might be called to testify. Your written statement is already part of the evidence packet, but the defense is going to want to question you directly. They're going to ask you about what happened to you, and they're going to ask you about me. They're going to try to discredit the entire investigation by claiming it was biased or that I coached you. Your testimony about what Brennan did to you, the sabotage, the threats, that's the foundation of this case. Without it, the recording is just an isolated incident. With it, it's a pattern of criminal behavior. Peters went quiet, his gaze dropping back to his untouched food. His hands were shaking, a subtle tremor he couldn't seem to control. I'm scared, Lieutenant. If I do this, his dad is a general. What if they retaliate, not just against me, but my family? My dad's a mechanic, my mom's a teacher. They don't have any protection. If a general wants to ruin us, he can. Reyna leaned forward, her voice intense. Listen to me, Peters. What we're doing here, it matters. It's not just about you, and it's not just about me. It's about every soldier who comes through this program after you. If we back down now, if we let fear win, nothing changes. Brennan gets away with it, and the next Marcus Brennan will feel even more entitled to do the same. The cycle just continues until someone finally says no more. I'm saying it. I need you to say it too. But what if we lose? Peters asked, his voice trembling. What if the hearing officer decides there's not enough evidence? What if he just walks? Then we lose, Raina said simply. But at least we fought. At least we stood up and said that this isn't acceptable. We don't control the outcome, but we control our own actions. I can't force you to testify, Peters. If you want to withdraw your statement, I'll understand. I'll even help you do it. But I'm asking you to be brave one more time. Not for me, but for the Rangers. Peters looked down at his eggs for a long time. The silence between them stretched out, filled only by the distant sounds of the kitchen. Finally, he looked back up at her, and while the fear was still there was a new spark of resolve in his eyes. You really think we can win this? I think we have a strong case, Raina said. A very strong case. But in a courtroom, nothing is ever guaranteed. All we can do is tell the truth. Peters nodded slowly, his jaw setting. Okay, I'll do it. I'll tell them everything, every word. Raina spent the rest of the morning in a state of hyper-focused preparation. She retreated to a small, windowless office Whitaker had secured for her, surrounding herself with her notes, the incident logs, and the transcripts of the recording. She went over every detail, anticipating the questions a defense attorney would throw at her. She knew they would look for any inconsistency, any moment where her memory might falter. She had to be perfect. At 1300, she changed into her dress uniform. It was the first time she'd worn it since arriving at Fort Benning. The dark blue fabric of the Navy uniform felt foreign after a week of blending in as a civilian contractor, but it also felt like armor. As she pinned her ribbons and her seal trident to her chest, she looked at herself in the small, cracked mirror on the wall. The person staring back looked older, harder. This wasn't the mission she had expected when she was recalled to active duty, but it was the mission she had. She met Whitaker at General Carson's headquarters at 1330. The colonel was also in his dress uniform, his chest covered in medals and ribbons that spoke to a long, distinguished career. He looked every inch the professional officer, but his eyes were weary. You ready for this? He asked as they walked toward the briefing room. As ready as I'll ever be, Raina replied. They were shown into a small room where General Carson waited with the JAG officer who would be presenting the government's case, a captain named Martinez. He was young, perhaps 30, with sharp, intelligent eyes and a no-nonsense demeanor that reminded Raina of a high-end litigator. He didn't look intimidated by the high stakes of the case. If anything, he looked energized. Lieutenant Thorne, I've reviewed your evidence, Martinez said, skipping the introductions. It's solid. The recording alone is a powerhouse, but I need to prepare you for who we're up against. Cadet Brennan's father didn't just hire a local lawyer, he brought in Malcolm Reeves. Whitaker let out a sharp, involuntary curse. Reeves, he got Reeves here that fast? Raina looked between them. Who's Reeves? The best defense attorney in military law, Martinez explained, his expression grim. Former JAG went private about 10 years ago. He specializes in high-profile cases, usually the ones where the defendant is guilty as hell but has enough money or rank to fight. He's brilliant, he's ruthless, and he's never lost an Article 32 hearing. Not once. He has a knack for making the prosecution's witnesses look like the criminals. There's a first time for everything, Raina said. Martinez offered a thin smile. That's the spirit. But don't underestimate him. Reeves doesn't just argue facts, he builds a narrative. He's going to attack your credibility, your methods, and your relationship with Colonel Whitaker. He's going to try to paint this entire investigation as a personal vendetta. He plays for keeps, Lieutenant. Be ready. The hearing was held in a large conference room that had been hastily converted into a makeshift courtroom. The long table at the front was occupied by the hearing officer, a lieutenant colonel named Davidson who looked like he'd rather be anywhere else. At the defense table sat Marcus Brennan and his 3 co-defendants. They were all in their dress uniforms, looking pale and significantly less confident than they had on the rooftop. Brennan, however, still had a flicker of defiance in his eyes, a smirking arrogance that suggested he still believed his father would save him. Behind them sat Malcolm Reeves. He was a silver-haired man in an impeccably tailored charcoal suit that probably cost more than a year of a cadet's salary. He sat with a quiet, relaxed confidence, his hands folded neatly on the table. He didn't look like a shark, which Raina knew made him even more dangerous. He looked like a statesman. Reyna and Whitaker took their seats in the small gallery as Captain Martinez set up his files at the prosecution table. When Davidson entered, the bailiff called the room to order, and everyone stood. The air in the room was thick with tension, the kind that precedes a storm. "Be seated," Davidson said, his voice echoing in the sterile room. "This is an Article 32 preliminary hearing to determine whether sufficient evidence exists to refer charges of attempted murder, conspiracy, assault, and conduct unbecoming to a general court-martial. The accused are Cadet Marcus Brennan, Cadet Jeffrey Vance, Cadet Thomas Hoskins, and Cadet Daniel Chen. Counsel, are you ready to proceed?" "The government is ready, sir," Martinez said, standing tall. "The defense is ready, sir," Reeves said, his voice smooth and melodious like a practiced orator. "Captain Martinez, call your first witness. The government calls Lieutenant Reyna Thorne, United States Navy." Reyna walked to the witness chair, her heels clicking rhythmically on the floor. She took the oath, her voice clear and steady, and sat down. Martinez began with the easy questions, establishing her background, her years of service, and her specific assignment to Fort Benning. He moved through the testimony with practiced ease, leading her to the events on the rooftop. "Lieutenant Thorne, in your professional opinion, based on your training and the events of that night, what was Cadet Brennan's intent when he pushed you toward the edge of that roof?" "His intent was to kill me," Reyna said, her voice echoing in the quiet room. "He stated it explicitly on the recording. He had a plan to make it look like an accident, and he was in the process of executing that plan when I went over the wall. And did you feel your life was in danger?" "Absolutely. A 6-story fall onto concrete is fatal. He knew that, and he acted with that outcome in mind." Martinez played the recording for the hearing officer. As Brennan's voice filled the room, Reyna watched Davidson's face. The lieutenant colonel remained expressionless, but his grip on his pen tightened until his knuckles turned white. The casual cruelty of the recording seemed to hang in the air long after Martinez clicked it off. "No further questions," Martinez said. Reeves stood up, and Reyna felt the atmosphere in the room shift. He didn't rush to the podium. He moved slowly, almost thoughtfully, as if he were simply having a conversation with an old friend. He stopped a few feet from Reyna and offered a polite, almost warm smile. "Lieutenant Thorne," Reeves began, his voice a soothing baritone. "You've had quite a career. 3 deployments to combat zones, multiple commendations, a member of the elite SEAL teams. It's very impressive." "Thank you," Reyna said, keeping her guard up. "But you are no longer on active duty, are you? In the traditional sense." "I am in the reserves. I was recalled for this specific assignment." "Recalled," Reeves repeated as if tasting the word. "Specifically to investigate the Ranger program, or were you recalled for a different purpose and then redirected to this investigation by an old friend?" Reyna saw the trap immediately. "Colonel Whitaker requested my expertise in evaluating training programs." "Expertise," Reeves said, tilting his head. "That's an interesting word. Tell me, Lieutenant, what expertise does a Navy SEAL have in evaluating Army Ranger training? They are different branches, different cultures, different methods. How many Army Ranger programs had you evaluated before this one?" "This was my first," Reyna admitted. "So you had no baseline for comparison," Reeves said, his voice hardening slightly. "No previous experience with how Rangers train, how they are selected, or how their internal culture operates. You were essentially an outsider brought in to judge a world you didn't understand. The principles of leadership and discipline are universal across special operations," Reyna replied. "I have 20 years of experience evaluating those principles." "Is that so?" Reeves moved a step closer. "Let's talk about your methods. You went undercover, posing as a civilian contractor. You misled these young men about your identity and your purpose. Is that correct?" "I was directed to observe without revealing my rank to ensure I saw the program's true nature." "Directed by Colonel Whitaker," Reeves said, his eyes sharpening. "Who, as we've established, is an old friend. In fact, you served with him 12 years ago on a deployment, didn't you? And you've maintained contact ever since. Holiday cards, emails, the occasional phone call. We are professional colleagues. So when the colonel needed someone to investigate a program he personally disagreed with, someone he could trust to find the evidence he wanted, he didn't go through official Army channels. He reached outside the branch to an old friend who owed him a favor." "Objection," Martinez said, standing up. "Relevance." Davidson looked at Reeves. "Where are you going with this, counselor?" "Establishing bias, sir," Reeves said smoothly. "If this investigation was born out of a pre-existing relationship and a desire for a specific outcome, it speaks directly to the objectivity of the findings." "I'll allow it," Davidson said, "but move it along." Reeves turned back to Reyna. "You documented 14 incidents in 7 days, and yet, despite being a highly trained combat veteran, you never once intervened to stop this abuse. Why not, Lieutenant? If you saw a soldier in danger, why did you just sit there with your notepad?" "I was gathering evidence of the full scope of the problem," Reyna said. "Intervening early would have compromised the investigation." Or, Reeves countered, his voice rising, "you were trying to manufacture a case. You were letting situations escalate, perhaps even encouraging them, so you would have more dramatic evidence to present to your friend the colonel. You went up on that rooftop at midnight, knowing full well that Cadet Brennan and his colleagues would be there. You went alone to a confrontation you essentially orchestrated." "I received a message asking me to meet them there," Reyna said. "A message you never reported to security," Reeves snapped. "A message you didn't tell anyone about until after the fact. You chose to go there, you chose to put yourself in that situation, and then you chose to go over the wall." He pulled a document from his folder and held it up. "Let me read from your own notes, Lieutenant. Quote, I need Brennan to commit fully to cross the line completely. Those are your words, correct?" Reyna's stomach tightened. "Yes, so you admit it. You wanted him to commit a crime. You weren't there to observe, you were there to bait him. You used yourself as a lure to create a criminal act where none might have existed otherwise. You, a trained operative, manipulated a group of young, stressed cadets into a situation that you then portrayed as attempted murder." "I didn't push myself over the edge, mister." Reeves, Reyna said, her voice cold. "They did. Their intent was clear the moment they surrounded me." "Their intent or your interpretation of it?" Reeves smiled, a predatory flash of teeth. "You knew you were never in real danger, didn't you? You have the training. You knew you could handle it. This wasn't a life-threatening situation for you. It was a theater production where you were the director and the star witness. No further questions." Reyna stepped down, her heart pounding in her chest. She could feel the eyes of the room on her, the weight of Reeves's implications hanging in the air like smoke. As she passed Martinez, he gave her a small, tight nod, but she could see the flicker of concern in his eyes. Reeves had done exactly what he promised. He had turned the victim into the architect of the crime. The next witness was Peters. Watching him walk to the stand was like watching a man walk toward a firing squad. He was pale, his eyes darting around the room as if looking for an exit. When he took the oath, his hand was shaking so badly he had to grip the edge of the witness stand to steady himself. Martinez was gentle with him, guiding him through his testimony. Peters spoke about the slashed water bladder, the way his equipment had been tampered with, and the constant, soul-crushing pressure Brennan had applied to him. He sounded honest, vulnerable, and deeply hurt. It was a powerful performance, but Reyna knew what was coming. Reeves stood up for the cross-examination, and the air seemed to leave the room. He didn't use the same aggressive tone he'd used with Reyna. Instead, he was soft, almost paternal. "Cadet Peters," Reeves began, "you've had a very difficult time in the Ranger program, haven't you? It's a high-pressure environment, one that breaks many good men." "Yes, sir," Peters whispered. "In fact, it's so difficult that you decided to leave, didn't you? You washed out 3 days ago." Peters blinked, looking confused. "What? No, sir, I'm still in the program. I mean, I'm on administrative hold for the hearing, but I haven't washed out." Reeves pulled a sheet of paper from his folder. "That's strange, because according to the records I have here, you submitted a voluntary withdrawal request yesterday afternoon at 1600 hours." The room went silent. Peters stared at the paper as if it were a poisonous snake. I never submitted anything. I didn't sign that." Reeves walked to the stand and handed the document to Peters. "This is a standard withdrawal form, Cadet. It has your name, your rank, and your signature at the bottom. Are you telling this hearing that you didn't sign this?" "I didn't," Peters cried, his voice cracking. "I swear I didn't sign anything." Martinez was on his feet instantly. "Sir, this is the first the government is hearing of any withdrawal. I'd like time to examine that document." Davidson looked at the paper, then at Reeves. "Where did this come from, Counselor?" "It was provided to me by the Ranger Training Battalion Administration this morning, sir," Reeves said, his voice smooth as silk. "It seems Cadet Peters may be having second thoughts about his testimony, or perhaps his memory of yesterday is as shaky as his memory of the training incidents. We'll take a 15-minute recess while counsel reviews the document," Davidson announced, banging his gavel. In the hallway, the atmosphere was chaotic. Peters was nearly hyperventilating, leaning against the wall while Whitaker tried to calm him down. "I didn't sign it, Colonel. I swear on my life that's not my signature. They're trying to ruin me." Martinez was staring at the photocopy of the form, his jaw set in a hard line. It's a good forgery, but it's a photocopy, which makes it nearly impossible to verify the ink or the pressure of the pen. Peters, did you talk to anyone yesterday about leaving? Anyone at all? No, I talked to my squad leader, Sergeant Morrison. I told him I was stressed about the hearing, but I never said I wanted to quit. I told him I wanted to see this through. Whitaker's eyes narrowed. Morrison, he's Brennan's primary instructor, the one who's been looking the other way for months. He pulled out his phone, his face a mask of cold fury. I'm calling the JAG office. This isn't just defense strategy, this is witness intimidation and forgery. When they returned to the hearing, Martinez addressed Davidson with a voice like tempered steel. Sir, Cadet Peters categorically denies signing this document. We believe this is a blatant attempt at witness tampering and fabrication of evidence. We request an immediate investigation into the origin of this form. Reeves didn't look bothered. He simply spread his hands in a gesture of innocence. I am merely presenting the documents provided to me by the Army's own administration. If there is a question of authenticity, that is a matter for the administrative staff, not for this hearing. Enough, Davidson said, his voice booming. I am ordering a handwriting analysis of that signature immediately. In the meantime, we will proceed with the testimony. But, Counselor, he said, looking directly at Reeves, if it turns out this document was fabricated to influence these proceedings, there will be severe consequences. Do I make myself clear? Abundantly, sir, Reeves said, though he didn't look the least bit worried. The damage, however, was done. Peters was rattled for the rest of his testimony, stumbling over his words and looking like a man who expected a trap behind every question. By the time Reeves finished with him, Peters looked broken. The hearing continued through the afternoon with the other three cadets, Vance, Hoskins, and Chen, taking the stand. They all followed a similar script, minimizing their roles and claiming they were simply following Brennan's lead, portrayals that Reeves gently encouraged. He was setting up a defense where Brennan was the only potential villain, and the others were merely misguided followers caught in the wake of a powerful personality. By 17:30, Davidson called a recess until the following morning. As Raina walked out of the hearing room, she felt a profound sense of exhaustion. They had the recording, they had the facts, but Reeves was successfully muddying the waters, turning the focus away from the crime and onto the investigators. Martinez caught up with them in the parking lot, his expression grim. Don't let him get in your head, Raina. He's a pro at this. He wants you to feel like you've lost ground so you'll make a mistake tomorrow. He made me look like I orchestrated the whole thing, Raina said, staring out at the darkening horizon. He tried, Martinez corrected. But the recording doesn't lie. Tomorrow we present the physical evidence and the formal incident logs. That's where we win. Get some rest. You're going to need it. But rest was the last thing on Raina's mind. As she drove back to her quarters, the feeling of being watched intensified. She couldn't shake the image of General Brennan's face, not the boy, but the father. He was out there somewhere, and he wasn't going to let his legacy be destroyed without a fight. Her phone rang as she was walking into her room. It was Whitaker. Turn on the news, Raina. Channel 7, now. She found the remote and flipped to the local news station. Her heart skipped a beat when she saw the image on the screen. It was General Marcus Brennan Sr. standing behind a podium in full dress uniform. He was holding a press conference, and he looked every inch the betrayed hero. My son is innocent of these sensationalized charges, the general was saying, his voice booming with authority. He is being targeted by a rogue investigator with a documented personal vendetta against the military. This entire investigation was conducted without proper oversight, using tactics that border on entrapment and criminal negligence. Raina felt the blood drain from her face. Lieutenant Raina Thorne, the general continued, his eyes locking onto the camera, presented herself as a civilian while hiding the fact that she is a former Navy SEAL with a history of disciplinary issues. We have evidence that will be presented to the court tomorrow showing that Lieutenant Thorne was previously investigated for excessive force during a mission in Afghanistan, an investigation that raises serious questions about her judgment and her stability. That's a lie, Raina whispered to the empty room. That's a complete lie. The general didn't stop there. She is using this investigation to settle old scores, to tear down a program she doesn't understand, and to destroy the career of a promising young officer who had the misfortune of being in her path. I am calling on the Secretary of the Army to intervene immediately and dismiss these baseless, politically motivated charges. The screen cut back to the news anchor, but Raina had already turned it off. Her phone was buzzing again. Whitaker. Jim, he's lying, she said as soon as she picked up. I was never investigated for excessive force. My record is spotless, you know that. I know that, Raina. Whitaker's voice was tight with anger. But he's saying it on national television. He's creating a narrative that the public and the hearing officer is going to hear. He's going to try to enter forged documents into the record tomorrow, just like they did with Peters. He's going to bury me, Raina said, her hands trembling. He's going to make me the villain to save his son. Not if we fight back, Whitaker said. I'm already on the phone with Norfolk. We're getting your complete certified service record sent over tonight by courier. We'll have the official documentation to prove he's lying. But Raina, he's desperate. A man like that with that much power is most dangerous when he's cornered. That night, the silence of the base felt oppressive. Raina sat in the dark, watching the shadows stretch across the floor. She thought about the cadets, about the system she had spent her life serving, and about the man who was willing to burn it all down to protect his own. At 0200, a soft, hesitant knock sounded at her door. She stood up, her hand instinctively moving toward the side table where she kept her weapon, her senses on high alert. She looked through the peephole and saw Cadet Peters standing in the hallway, still in his uniform, looking like he hadn't slept a second since the hearing adjourned. She opened the door, and for a moment they just looked at each other in the dim light of the corridor. The battle wasn't over. In fact, it felt like it was only just beginning. The shadows in the hallway seemed to stretch and twist, mirroring the turmoil in the young man's eyes. Cadet Peters stood in the doorway of Raina's quarters, his breath coming in shallow, jagged hitches that betrayed the sheer terror vibrating through his frame. He looked smaller than he had the day before, the weight of a powerful machine finally beginning to crush his resolve. Without a word of greeting, the words spilled out of him like a confession. They had come to his room, he told her, his voice a ghost of its former self. Two men, strangers with faces obscured and intentions clear, had delivered a message that was as cold as it was precise. If he stepped onto that witness stand tomorrow, if he dared to repeat the truth he had already shared, his family would pay the ultimate price. They didn't just make vague threats. They recited his parents' home address, the name of his little sister's elementary school, and the exact timing of her daily commute. The message was unmistakable. The truth was a luxury his family couldn't afford. Raina didn't hesitate. She reached out, gripping his shoulder with a firm, grounding hand, and pulled him inside the room, locking the door behind them with a definitive click. The silence of the quarters felt heavy, charged with the sudden realization that the stakes had shifted from a career-ending scandal to a matter of life and death. She asked him if he could identify them, searching for any detail that might give them an edge, but Peters could only shake his head. They had worn masks, their identities hidden behind layers of tactical precision and calculated anonymity. He looked at her then, his eyes wide and pleading, asking the question that every victim of systemic power eventually asks. What if they are serious? What if the institution he had sworn to serve was the very thing that would destroy the people he loved? Reeves and his benefactors had resources that a 21-year-old cadet couldn't even fathom. Looking at him, Raina felt a surge of protective fury that transcended her role as an investigator. This was a young man who had come to the military with dreams of honor, only to be met with the jagged edges of corruption. She made a decision in that moment, one that bypassed the cold logic of protocol and spoke directly to the core of her own identity. She promised him, her voice a low, steady anchor in the storm of his fear, that if anything happened to him or his family, she would personally ensure that the people responsible paid a price they couldn't survive. It wasn't a platitude. It was a vow from a woman who had spent 2 decades hunting monsters in the dark. Peters searched her face, looking for a crack in her resolve, and seeing none, he found a sliver of hope. He asked if she really believed they could beat them. Raina's answer was simple. They had to try, because if they let fear dictate their actions, the battle was already over before the first word was spoken in court. After the military police arrived to take Peters into protective custody, Raina sat alone in the dim light of her quarters. The bravado of her promise lingered in the air, but the weight of it pressed down on her chest. General Brennan was a man of immense reach, a 3-star titan with connections that snaked through the highest levels of the Pentagon and into the halls of political power. She was a single officer, a specialist brought in to do a job that was becoming more dangerous by the hour. But as she watched the moonlight filter through the window, she reminded herself of the one thing Brennan didn't have: the truth. It was a fragile weapon, often easily discarded or buried, but when wielded with enough force, it could shatter the most elaborate deceptions. The next morning, the hearing room at 0900 felt like a pressure cooker. The air was thick with the scent of stale coffee and the oppressive formality of dress uniforms. The gallery was no longer empty. Word of the case had spread through the ranks like a wildfire, drawing in senior NCOs and officers who wanted to see if the legendary Golden Boy of Fort Benning was actually going to be held to account. In the back row, the glint of camera lenses and the scratching of journalists' pens signaled that the world outside the base was finally watching. Captain Martinez took his seat, his face a mask of exhaustion, looking as though he had spent the entire night battling ghosts. Before the proceedings could officially resume, Martinez stood to address the court. The air in the room seemed to vanish as he detailed the incident of witness intimidation from the night before. He didn't mince words, describing the threats against Peter's family as a direct assault on the integrity of the military justice system. The defense attorney, Reeves, was on his feet before Martinez could even finish, his voice dripping with practiced indignation. He claimed no knowledge of the incident and resented the implication that his defense team had any hand in such thuggery. The presiding officer, Colonel Davidson, didn't look impressed. He leaned forward, his gaze piercing, and warned Reeves that if any evidence emerged linking the defense to such tactics, the charges would be the least of their worries. The first witness called by the government was Colonel James Whitaker. He walked to the stand with the rigid, unmistakable posture of a man who had spent his entire life in uniform. As Martinez walked him through the origins of the investigation, Whitaker's voice remained steady, a bedrock of professional competence. He explained the parameters of Reyna's mission, the evidence that had been meticulously gathered, and his professional opinion that her investigation had been conducted with the utmost adherence to protocol. When asked about the Rooftop incident, Whitaker didn't hesitate. He described it as the logical culmination of a pattern of escalation that Brennan had been exhibiting for weeks. It wasn't an accident, it was a conclusion. But then, it was Reeves' turn. The defense attorney approached the witness stand like a predator circling a wounded animal. He didn't start with the evidence, he started with the man. He dug into the history between Whitaker and Reyna, painting their 12-year-old professional relationship as a deep-seated conspiracy of friends. He produced emails, stripping away the context to make Whitaker's desire for an objective truth look like a demand for a preordained result. He accused Whitaker of bringing in a friend to manufacture a case because he couldn't find anything real on Brennan. The room held its breath as Reeves pivoted to the real kill shot. He asked Whitaker about his history with General Marcus Brennan. The question landed with the force of a detonated charge. Whitaker's face went pale, a flicker of old resentment crossing his features before he could mask it. Reeves didn't let up. He brought up a promotion that had been denied 5 years prior, a recommendation against Whitaker's advancement written by the general himself. He framed the entire investigation not as a search for justice, but as a long-gestating act of revenge by a bitter officer against the man who had stalled his career. Martinez tried to object, arguing that Whitaker's past was irrelevant to the charges against the son, but Davidson allowed the line of questioning to continue, citing the need to establish potential bias. Reeves leaned in, his voice a low, accusatory hiss. He suggested that Whitaker had deliberately put Reyna in danger on that rooftop, sending her in without backup or security, not because he trusted her skills, but because he needed a dramatic, violent incident to ensure the charges against Brennan's son would stick. He called it entrapment. He called it a setup. He called it a betrayal of a fellow officer. Watching from her seat, Reyna saw the doubt begin to cloud Whitaker's eyes. He had been a soldier's soldier, a man who believed in the chain of command and the sanctity of the mission. And now he was being forced to wonder if his own subconscious grievances had led him to put her life on the line. When he finally stepped down, his shoulders were slumped, the weight of the accusation visible in the way he walked. It was a masterful performance by Reeves, a tactical dismantling of a man's character that left the prosecution's foundation trembling. The afternoon didn't bring any relief. Sergeant Thomas Rodriguez, the instructor who had witnessed Brennan's arrogance firsthand, took the stand next. He spoke of the disruption, the undermining of authority, and the pervasive sense of entitlement that Brennan brought into the classroom. But under Reeves' cross-examination, Rodriguez was forced to admit that he had never filed a formal disciplinary report. He had been told to give him space by his chain of command, an instruction he had interpreted as a directive to protect the general's son. Reeves pounced on this, portraying Rodriguez as a man who made assumptions and used them to justify his own professional negligence. One by one, the witnesses were being picked apart, their observations framed as hearsay, their motives questioned, and their credibility eroded. By the time the lunch break arrived, the air in the prosecution's camp was one of mounting desperation. Martinez was visibly sweating, the solid case they had built the day before now appearing to be riddled with cracks. But after the break, Martinez played his most significant card, the rooftop recording. As the audio began to play, a silence so profound it felt physical descended upon the room. The cold, calculating voice of Marcus Brennan filled the space, stripped of its youthful charm and replaced by a chilling arrogance. He spoke of sabotage, of his contempt for Peters, and his plan to make Reyna's death look like a tragic accident. It was the sound of a predator who believed he was untouchable. When the recording ended, the silence lingered, vibrating with the horror of what everyone had just heard. Colonel Davidson turned his gaze toward the defense table, his eyes fixed on the young man whose voice had just condemned him. He asked if Brennan had made those statements. Brennan stood, his lawyer at his side, and delivered a response that had been carefully rehearsed for maximum impact. He didn't deny the words. He claimed they were spoken under duress. He painted a picture of a young cadet being harassed and followed by an aggressive, overzealous investigator. He claimed the rooftop encounter was an attempt to scare her off, to make her leave him alone. He looked Davidson in the eye and claimed he hadn't pushed her over the edge. He claimed she had jumped herself as part of a calculated plan to frame him. The room erupted. The audacity of the lie was so blatant, so staggering, that it felt like a slap in the face to everyone who had ever worn the uniform. Reyna felt a white-hot rage burning in her chest, a physical need to stand up and shout the truth. But she remained still, her hands clenched into fists beneath the table. She watched as Reeves stood and delivered the final blow of the day. He called Lieutenant Reyna Thorne to the stand. Walking to that witness chair felt like walking toward a firing squad. She was sworn in, her voice clear and unwavering despite the storm inside her. Reeves approached her with a folder, his expression one of feigned respect. He began by praising her service record, her 20 years of dedication, her deployments, and her commendations. It was a setup. He then produced a document that he claimed was a record of an investigation into her conduct during a 2018 mission in Kandahar. He read aloud allegations of excessive force, of the unnecessary killing of enemy combatants who could have been captured. Reyna stared at the paper, her mind racing. The incident he was describing had happened, but the investigation he was citing was a complete fabrication. There had been no inquiry, no reprimand, and certainly no finding of excessive force. She told him as much, her voice steady even as she realized the depth of the trap. Reeves simply smiled and handed the document to the judge, offering it as evidence of a pattern of aggression and questionable judgment. Martinez was on his feet, shouting about the need to verify the document, calling it an ambush. The proceedings ground to a halt as Davidson reviewed the paper, noting its official appearance and signatures. He called for a 2-hour recess to allow for verification, but the damage was already done. In the hallway, Whitaker was frantically trying to reach Reyna's former commanding officer, Vice Admiral Chen, but the response was a brick wall. Chen was on a classified assignment, unreachable and unavailable for comment. When the hearing reconvened, the prosecution had no evidence to debunk the lie, and Davidson had no choice but to enter the document into the record. Reeves wasn't finished. He brought out another report, this one from a psychologist named Dr. Sarah Mitchell. Though she had never met Reyna, she had reviewed her file and concluded that her years in combat had left her with a tendency toward paranoia and a predisposition to see threats where none existed. She suggested that Reyna had engineered the entire rooftop incident, provoking Brennan, and then faking a near-death experience to ensure his conviction. The narrative was being rewritten in real time, turning the victim into the villain and the predator into the prey. Davidson looked at Reyna, his expression one of weary contemplation. He asked her directly if there was any possibility that her own experiences had colored her interpretation of Brennan's actions. Reyna met his gaze, her eyes hard as flint. She told him that she knew the difference between a cadet being stupid and a soldier committing murder. She told him that what happened on that roof was a calculated attempt on her life, and no amount of fabricated documents or armchair psychology could change the reality of that night. The judge called for a final 30-minute recess before making his ruling. Those 30 minutes were the longest of Reyna's life. She sat in the hallway, surrounded by the ghosts of her career and the very real threat of a powerful man's influence. She saw other officers walking past, their eyes averted, the social contagion of a scandal already beginning to isolate her. She saw Peters, his face etched with a fear that had returned with a vengeance. He asked her what would happen if Brennan walked free, and for the first time, Reyna didn't have an answer that could offer him peace. When they were called back into the room, the atmosphere was electric. Davidson began his ruling by acknowledging the complexity of the case. He spoke of the damning nature of the recording, but also of the legitimate questions raised by the defense regarding bias and entrapment. Reyna felt her heart sink, bracing for the words that would let a monster go free. But then, Davidson shifted. He noted that entrapment was not a valid defense when the accused was already predisposed to the crime, and the testimony of multiple witnesses had established a clear pattern of harassment and intimidation by Brennan. He looked directly at Marcus Brennan. He announced that sufficient evidence existed to refer the charges of attempted assault, conspiracy, and conduct unbecoming to a general court-martial. He reduced the attempted murder charge to assault with intent to cause bodily harm, citing a lack of conclusive evidence of specific intent to kill, but the victory was still massive. The case was going to trial. The shield of the general's influence had been cracked. The room exploded into a chaotic din of whispers and movement. General Brennan, who had been watching from the back row like a silent sentinel, stood and walked out without a single word to his son. The betrayal in Marcus's eyes was absolute as he was led out in handcuffs, followed by his co-defendants. Martinez was grinning, the weight finally lifting from his shoulders, but Reyna felt only a cold, hollow sense of anticipation. They had won the battle, but the war was just beginning. The 3 months leading up to the trial were a relentless grind. General Brennan's legal team threw every imaginable obstacle in the prosecution's path, attempting to bury them in motions, appeals, and further character assassinations. But the truth, once it has been given a voice, is a difficult thing to silence. The fabrication of the Kandahar document was eventually exposed, and the expert psychologist's credentials were torn apart under closer scrutiny. When the trial finally arrived, it wasn't held in a small hearing room at Fort Benning, but in a full military court with a jury of peers who were not as easily swayed by a general's stars. The deliberation lasted 4 hours. When the verdict was read, the word guilty rang out through the courtroom with the finality of a hammer on an anvil. Marcus Brennan was sentenced to 6 years in a military prison, a dishonorable discharge, and the total forfeiture of all benefits. His life as he knew it, the life of privilege and protected cruelty, was over. His co-defendants received lesser sentences, but their military careers were equally destroyed. 2 weeks later, General Brennan announced his retirement, his decades of service ending in the shadow of his son's disgrace rather than the light of his own achievements. The aftermath of the trial brought a wave of change to Fort Benning. The Ranger program, once a bastion of good old boy protectionism, underwent a systematic overhaul. New leadership was brought in, new oversight was established, and the culture of silence began to erode. It wasn't an overnight transformation, but the seeds of accountability had been planted. 6 months after the verdict, Reyna stood in a sun-drenched field watching the graduation ceremony for the newest class of Rangers. At the front of the line stood Peters. He had stayed in the program, enduring the whispers and the pressure, and had emerged at the very top of his class. When he received his Ranger tab, he looked toward the audience, finding Reyna's face in the crowd. The salute he gave her was not just one of military courtesy, but of profound gratitude. Afterward, he told her that he intended to spend his career being the kind of leader who protected those under his command rather than exploiting them. He had seen the worst of the system, and it had made him want to be the best of it. Before she left the base for the last time, Colonel Whitaker invited Raina to speak to the incoming class of candidates. She stood before a sea of young, eager faces, men and women who believed they were made of iron and fire. She didn't give them a speech about glory or the thrill of combat. She told them the truth. She told them that real strength wasn't about who you could crush, but who you could carry. She told them that the uniform didn't bestow honor. It only provided the opportunity to earn it every single day through their choices. She told them the story of Marcus Brennan and the story of Peters, and she asked them which legacy they wanted to leave behind. When she finished, 100 soldiers stood and saluted her in a silence that felt like a prayer. It was the highest honor she had ever received, a recognition from the next generation that the fight she had fought mattered. As she drove through the gates of Fort Benning, the setting sun casting long, golden shadows across the Georgia pines, Raina felt a sense of peace she hadn't known in years. She had been pushed off a roof, she had been smeared in court, and she had been threatened by the most powerful men in her world. But she was still standing. She had proven that the truth, when defended by someone who refuses to break, is the most powerful force in the world. The road ahead was uncertain, and she knew there would be other fights, other monsters, and other systems to challenge. But as the base faded into the distance in her rearview mirror, she knew she was ready for whatever came next. Because some people don't just survive the fall, they learn how to fly.